The silent contamination. I don't know where to start, but I need to tell you this because until now I didn't understand what happened. It was an ordinary day, nothing special. My husband, Michael, had gone to work, and in the middle of the afternoon I got a call that he had been in a car accident near a busy intersection in Portland, Oregon. It was nothing serious, at least that's what the hospital had guaranteed me when I got there. He looked normal, just a little shaken, and with a superficial cut on the forehead. The doctor said he was fine, but that it would be good to observe for a few days if he had symptoms of a concussion. I took him home that night and thought it would be just another scare we will soon forget. But that very morning, everything changed. I woke up to a strange noise coming from the room, as if something was crawling on the floor. At first, I thought it was one of my children, maybe Ethan or Lily, who had gotten up to get water or something. But when I looked out the door, I saw Michael. He was standing in the middle of the room, only there was something very wrong. He was shaking, sweating a lot and breathing heavily, almost as if having an asthma attack. When I called him, he turned his head too slowly, as if he did not recognize me. His eyes were different. It was as if he was looking through me. At that moment, I was frozen. I can't explain why, but the way he looked at me gave me a shiver that ran through my spine. I forced myself to ask him if he was okay, but my voice came out almost like a whisper. He didn't answer. He just stood still, breathing in a strange way. The kitchen light was on, and I could see his face better. The cut on the forehead, which before seemed small, was now more red, almost swollen, as if something was pulsating under the skin. I was scared and ran to him to try to help him, but when I got close he held my arm so hard that it made me scream. It was not the Michael I knew. His strength was absurd, as if he was hurting me without even realizing. I managed to pull myself loose and ran back into the room. I locked the door and leaned against it, trying to hear his movements. My heart seemed to want to come out of the mouth. He started walking around the house, dragging his feet on the ground as if he was disoriented, but the weight of the footsteps was much higher than normal. My oldest son, Ethan, woke up to the noise and appeared in the hallway. I saw the reflection of a crack in the door, but could not warn him in time. When Michael saw it, he approached too fast, almost in a leap. Ethan screamed, and in that second, I knew that what was in the room was no longer my husband. I opened the door of the room on impulse, with my heart pounding, and yelled for Ethan to run to me. He came running, but Michael, or whatever he had become, went after him. It was a bizarre chase, because he moved in a way that did not seem human, with heavy steps but too fast. When Ethan came through the door, I closed it with all my strength and held the handle while Michael hit it on the other side. Each knock made the wood shake, and I thought he would break the door at any moment. Ethan was crying, wondering what was going on, and I didn't know what to answer. How do you explain to a child that her father, who was supposed to protect her, is now the reason why we are all in danger? Lily, my youngest daughter, woke up from the noise and started crying in her room. My instinct was to run to get it, but how? Michael was between us and the exit. The door banging stopped suddenly, and the silence that remained was even more terrifying. I could only hear my breath and Ethan's, who was trying to muffle the crying. It was then that I noticed a strange sound coming from the corridor, like a low and constant growl. It didn't seem human. My mind tried to find some logical explanation for that, but nothing made sense. Took the phone to call 911, but had no signal. It was impossible because the signal in our house on the outskirts of Portland was always great. It was as if something was blocking everything. I knew we couldn't wait there, so I took courage and unlocked the bedroom window. I asked Ethan to leave first, even with him trembling with fear. As he passed through the window, I could hear the sound of Michael's footsteps again, but now they were slow, as if he was trying to scare us. As soon as Ethan jumped out, I told him to run into the yard and hide. I knew I had to pick up Lily before I left. It was not a choice. She was still so small that she could never escape alone. When I looked down the corridor through the crack of the door, I saw Michael standing in the middle, his head tilted to one side, watching me. The way he seemed calculating. I knew I had to be quick. I ran down the hall with my heart almost coming out of my mouth and entered Lily's room. I took her on my lap, and she was so scared that she didn't say a word, just grabbed my neck with all her strength. But before I could leave, I saw his shadow blocking the door. He was there, staring back at me. Only this time, I noticed that your eyes were different. Not only the empty look of before, but something more, almost bright, as if he had a fever so high that his eyes were reflecting light. He took a step towards me, and the ground seemed to shake. Lily started crying softly, and I could only think that I needed to get her out of there no matter how. I didn't have much choice. With Lily in my lap, I turned and ran to the bathroom, which is next to her room. Locked the door as soon as I walked in, and put a towel under the door to muffle any sound. He came right after. First, I heard the heavy footsteps stopping on the other side of the door, then the sound of nails. Yes, nails scratching the wood. It was a high-pitched sound, which seemed to echo inside my head. Lily was squeezing my neck as if she knew something terrible was outside, and I tried, without success, to calm her down. The scratch stopped, but the silence that came after was even worse. All I could hear was my fast breathing and the distant noise of the wind outside. After a few minutes, or maybe it was seconds, I don't know, he started knocking on the door. It was not a normal knock, it was something fierce, as if he wanted to cross the wood with his fists. The door seemed to give way at any moment. That's when I heard Ethan screaming outside the house. My heart froze. I knew I had to get out of there, but how? The bathroom had a small window, almost impossible to pass through. Even so, I unlocked it and tried to push Lily out. She was trapped by an instant, and I thought I was going to lose it, but I managed to push it hard enough to pass. As she left, I heard the bathroom door crack behind me. I didn't look back. I just threw myself out of the window. When I fell in the garden, I felt a sharp pain in my ankle, but I couldn't stop. I took Lily in my arms again and looked for Ethan. He was in the back of the yard, hiding behind a pile of firewood. I ran to him limping, while trying to calm Lily, who was still crying softly. The wind was getting stronger, and the sound of the trees swaying seemed to amplify the nightmare mood. It was when I heard a loud noise coming from inside the house, as if something had been thrown against the wall. And soon after, the sound of glass shattering. He was trying to get out. Just thinking about it, my vision began to darken with panic, but I forced myself to keep moving. We needed to get to the car. With both in my arms, I went to the garage, but when I arrived, I realized that the keys were inside the house. My heart sank. I knew there was no way back, so I looked around, looking for anything that could be used to protect us or escape. It was then that I heard that growl again, now outside the house. He was close, very close. The sound seemed to come from all sides, as if it was surrounding us. Ethan started crying and saying he was scared, and I could only hold the two as tight as possible. Didn't know what to do, but knew that if we stayed there, he would find us. Completely out of options, I made the most desperate decision I could imagine: run to the shed in the backyard. Inside, there were some tools, nothing that seemed enough to face whatever Michael had become, but it was the only place where we could lock ourselves. With Lily and Ethan clenched against me, I ran limping as fast as I could. Each step seemed a monumental effort, especially with the weight in their arms and the sound of his heavy steps getting closer and closer. As soon as we got to the shed, I closed the door and locked it with the rusty latch. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. Inside the shed, it was dark and damp. The smell of oil and old wood was almost suffocating. I tried to keep the children quiet, but my heart was so fast that it seemed like he could hear only that from outside. And then came the sound. First, slow steps in the yard, and then the sound of something scraping against the walls of the shed. He knew where we were. The door barked when he pushed it. I closed my eyes and began to whisper to the children that everything was going to be fine, even though I knew it was a lie. Suddenly, absolute silence took over. No wind, no steps, no growling, only silence. And then something even more terrifying happened. The latch began to move itself, as if it was on the other side, trying to open the door quietly. When I saw the latch moving, my body froze. It was as if time had stopped and everything around me had slowed down. He was trying to open the door, but in an almost calculating way. It wasn't the brute force of before. It was something scary, like he wanted me to know that he was in control. I held the children even harder, as my mind ran for any way out. It was then that I remembered the small window at the bottom of the shed. It was not much bigger than the bathroom, but it was our only chance. I whispered to Ethan to get a toolbox while he tried to keep Lily calm. When he put the box in place, I helped him up and out first. As soon as Ethan passed, I started pushing Lily out the window, but at this point, the shed door began to crack. The hinges rattled high, as if they were about to break. He was applying force now. My heart seemed to explode, but I managed to push Lily out even with her crying and relenting. When she came out, I climbed up into the box and started squeezing myself out of the window. I was almost outside when I heard the door behind me burst. The sound was so loud that it echoed through the entire yard. I did not look back, used all the strength I had and threw myself out, falling straight into the wet ground. Lily and Ethan helped me up, and we ran without looking back, not even knowing where we were going. The adrenaline was driving me, even with the ankle throbbing and each step being a torture. We ran towards the darkest part of the yard, where there was a trail that led to the bush behind the house. It didn't make sense, but it seemed better than staying there. The children were clinging to me, sobbing with fear, and I could only think of keeping them alive. As we ran, I heard that growl again, but this time it seemed to come from several places at once, as if echoing among the trees. The air was thick, and each breath seemed harder. Ethan tripped, but I pulled him back before he fell. I couldn't leave him behind. The sound of his steps, or whatever it had become, seemed closer, as if he was hunting us. Finally, we saw a small stream in the middle of the forest. It was not deep, but the water ran fast and made a noise that for an instant gave me a sense of relief. I knew Michael was around, but thought maybe the sound of the stream could help us hide. We took the children and crouched behind a large stone. We stood there in absolute silence, trying not to make the slightest movement. The icy wind hit my face, but I barely felt it. They were equipped with our sounds around. For a moment, I thought we might have lost him. But then I heard branches breaking, and there he was, standing at the edge of the stream. Even in the dark, I can see those eyes shining. He turned his head slowly, sniffing the air, as if he knew exactly where we were. He was so close that I could almost smell the wet earth mixed with his sweat. It was a strange, metallic smell that sticks in the air. Michael, or what's left of him, seemed to be in a state of alert, as if he was tracking us. The way he moved his head, the fast and precise movements, were of someone who was no longer human. Lily squeezed my arm so hard that I felt my nails start to sink into the skin, but I didn't have the courage to make any sound. Everything in me screamed to run, but my legs did not obey. He started moving along the stream, his feet pounding in the water, creating that constant sound of splashing. With each step, my heart seemed to beat faster, as if he was going to hear only that. Then something happened that still haunts me. He suddenly stopped in the middle of the stream and was completely still. It was as if he had turned off. For a few seconds, he did not move or do anything. Even the wind seemed to stop. And then he let out a scream, or rather, a sound that sounded like a mixture of human cry as something wild. It was so loud and disturbing that the birds in the nearby trees flew away. This sound was what cut off the trance I was in. I took the children, held their hands with all my strength and ran. I did not look back, even hearing his footsteps again, now faster and more erratic. All I could think about was to keep running, even without knowing where. I don't know how I got it, but we ran until we reached a dirt road, where I saw the headlights of a car along. It was as if a miracle had happened. I screamed and nodded, ignoring the fact that my voice was enmeshed with pure despair. The car stopped, and a man came out, clearly confused to see us in that state. I couldn't explain what was going on. How do you explain something like that? I could only beg him to take us away. He helped us into the car while I was still looking back, hoping to see Michael coming out of the woods at any time. But he didn't show up. The man traveled several miles to reach a gas station. It was only then that I realized that I was shaking from head to toe, but still holding the children with all my strength. To this day, I don't know what happened to Michael. When we came back with the police the next morning, the house was empty. There was no sign of breaking in, nor anything out of place, except the destroyed door of the shed. They searched for him in the forest, but never found anything. The only thing strange was his car, which was still parked in the garage, with the keys on the contact. Nobody believed my story, and honestly I don't know if I would have believed it if I was in their shoes. But the kids, they remember. And even today, when the wind blows strong at night, Ethan asks me if he will return. I do not have the courage to tell the truth, that I do not know, because deep down, a part of me feels that it's not over yet. The abandoned resort. I don't know where to start right, but I'll try to put everything here. It was last winter when our boss sent us to work in the Rocky Mountains, Colorado. It was to evaluate an abandoned ski resort, an old thing from the 70s, I think. It seemed a simple project. Take a look at the structure, list what needs to be repaired, and then start the renovation. It was a small group, only 5 of us, and the trip started off kind of weird. The roads were covered with snow, and the place was more isolated than we thought. No cell phone signal right after we left the main road. We arrived there in the late afternoon, and honestly, the first impression was already bad. The resort was falling apart, with broken windows and roof full of holes. It didn't seem like a place that someone should step in again, you know? That first night, I already felt that something was wrong. We set up camp in one of the less destroyed cottages, trying to keep us away from the cold. The portable generator was noisy, but it contained some lights and heated the room. We were having dinner, everyone relaxed after the day, tired, when we heard something. It was a distant sound, as if something was scratching the walls outside. We thought it was the wind or maybe a small animal, because the place was surrounded by forest. But when one of the guys, Tom, went out to check, he came back pale, holding the door tight. He just said, "You need to see this." Outside in the snow, there were footprints. Huge, more plausible than a person, but no one there was so big. Everyone went out to look, even with the cold cutting. The footprints were about 40 centimeters long, maybe more, and they were wide, as if a barefoot but gigantic person had walked there. Only that it doesn't make sense, because the snow was intact around, with no trace of where the thing could have come or gone. Just the marks, right in front of the chalet. Someone said it could be a bear, but the bear does not leave footprints like this, with 5 perfectly defined fingers. We decided to go in and lock the door, thinking that maybe it was some kind of joke. Who else would be there in the middle of nowhere, at this time of winter? The next morning, things got worse. When we left to get started on work, we noticed that the generator had been turned off during the night. Not only off, the wires were cut, as if someone had used a tool. It left us with a bad taste in our mouth, because it was not possible that an animal had done that. While we checked the damage, Tom pointed to the hill behind the resort. Up there, near one of the abandoned ski slopes, something was moving. It was far away, but it looked like a figure. Tall, thin, and with a dark color that contrasted with the white snow. It stayed there for a few seconds, motionless, before disappearing into the forest. After that, the tension between people became palpable. Work was slow because no one wanted to get too far away from the main chalet. Every noise in the forest seemed louder, closer. In the afternoon, while we were trying to recover the generator, we heard a sound that even today gives me shivers just remembering. It was something between a scream and a groan, as if a person was in much pain, but distorted, as if the sound was not natural. He echoed through the trees, and everyone stopped what they were doing. No one had the courage to say anything, but you could see in each other's eyes that we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever it was not human. When night came, we made a makeshift barricade with old furniture on the doors and windows. We have no other option, since our radio for emergency communication did not work, probably because of the altitude. The temperature was dropping, and the silence outside was almost unbearable. The only thing that was heard was the occasional clatter of wood squeezing in the cold. Then, around midnight, it began. First, heavy steps in the snow outside, circling the chalet. Then that again, only this time it seemed to come from all useful things, as if several things were surrounding us. The strangest? You couldn't see anything through the windows, even with the flashlight pointed. It was as if the sound was there, but the shadows didn't follow. We were in absolute silence, trying not to do anything. Tom held a screwdriver like it was a gun, and Mike, the oldest in the group, mumbled that we should have left as soon as we saw the footprints. But how do you leave? Our only transport, a truck, was parked about 200 meters from the chalet. Nobody had the courage to leave at that moment, especially after we heard something hit the wall. It was a loud bang, which made even the ceiling vibrate. It seemed that something huge had thrown against the chalet, testing our improvised structure. We were paralyzed, waiting for the wood to give way, but after a few minutes the sound stopped. Silence returned, but this time it was worse. It was dense, as if he himself was in the instructions. Suddenly the lights of the cottage blinked and went out. We were in total darkness, with only our lanterns to illuminate the interior. The kerosene smell of the portable heater was starting to make me nauseous, or maybe it was fear. Then we heard a low sound right near the door, something scratching, but slowly, almost as if he was playing with us. It was as if he knew we were inside, that we were terrified. Mike started whispering a prayer, and I could only think that no one would believe us if we got out of there alive. It was when we heard what seemed to be a voice. No, not a voice, but something trying to imitate one. "Help!" came out muffled, dragged and strange, as if the words were not meant to be said by that. Nobody moved. That grotesque attempt to imitate a human voice paralyzed us. It was impossible to know if he was cheating or if he really was someone in need of help. But deep down, we all knew that no one out there would be human. The scratching at the door stopped, but the feeling of being observed continued, as if invisible eyes were crossing us. Suddenly, a metallic noise echoed from outside near the truck. Took my flashlight and went to the nearest window, praying not to see anything. But of course I saw. Something was down by the truck hood, confusing something. He was tall, much taller than anyone I had ever seen, and moved with an agility that did not match his size. What made me panic was when he talked to himself and turned his face towards me. I could not distinguish details, but their eyes, they reflect the light of my lantern as those of an animal, only that fixed, analyzing, as if they were studying every movement. Ran out of the window, almost stumbling, and I shouted to the others that the truck was compromised. Mike ran to confirm and came back saying the tires had been torn and the engine probably destroyed. We were stuck. There was no way out but to wait and hope that it would go away with the dawn. But the idea of spending another night there seemed unbearable. The night was endless. We all stood together in the center of the cottage, lanterns lit, as if the light were a barrier against what was around us. The cold seemed to have intensified, despite the portable heater. It was as if something sucked the heat from the room, leaving the air heavy and humid. The silence outside was broken only by sporadic children, sincere steps that approach and then move away, these bushes in the forest, and sometimes that horrible sound, the cry moaning that echoed as if it came from all sides. Nobody could sleep. Every second that passed made the panic grow. At about 4 a.m, when fatigue was already beating us, we heard a deafening bang coming from the roof. Something had fallen or jumped up there. The beams creaked as if they were to give way, and the sound of steps echoed above us, slow, deliberate. It was moving from one side to the other, as if it informed us exactly where we were. Mike pointed a lantern at the ceiling, but all we saw were the dancing shadows. Then suddenly the thing stopped well above the room we were in. The sound ceased, but we could hear something breathing. It was heavy, irregular, almost animalistic, but with a rhythm that seemed human. No one dared to make noise until, as in a nightmare, he began scratching the ceiling directly above us. The sound of scratching was almost unbearable, like giant nails tearing at the wood. It was methodical, constant, as if it were testing the strength of the ceiling or simply teasing us. My mind was at 1,000. Would the roof hold? Would it go down? We were all with our hearts racing, exchanging looks without knowing what to do. Tom pressed the screwdriver so hard that his hands shook. Then I did nothing. The sound stopped. The silence was even more terrifying because we knew that it was still there, only now it was waiting. When the first ray of sun began to illuminate the windows, The tension lingered, but the fear continued. Still, no one had the courage to go out and check on the situation. We stayed quiet until we were sure it was already light. Finally, Tom and Mike decided that we needed to see the status of the truck and try to find a way out, even if it meant walking to the nearest village. They came while I and the others stood behind, watching out of the windows. When they reached the truck, the horror was even greater. The engine was completely destroyed, the cables torn off as if a brutal force had been pulled. The trail of giant footprints is from the truck to the forest, disappearing among the trees. After seeing the condition of the truck, Tom and Mike came back in a hurry. Their nervousness only confirmed what we already knew. We were completely isolated and without any means of communication or transportation. The decision was to try to walk out of the mountain, but before that we needed to get as little supplies as possible. While we were collecting our things, I noticed something strange at the door of the cottage. There was, as if something had passed the nail marks on the wood for one night. The units were deep, and you could see splinters scattered on the ground. It was a clear reminder that whatever it was testing our defenses. We left soon after, moving in a line through the deep snow, but the feeling of being delivered never left us. The forest seemed darker and more oppressive than it should, even with the sun shining above. At each step, the silence was interrupted by these bushes or by the sound of falling snow, which made us turn sharply in the direction of the noise. But we never saw anything. After an hour of walking, I discovered something that made my stomach turn. One of the tools I had left in the truck, a wrench, was stuck in a tree trunk. It was impossible for anyone to do this without heavy equipment or an absurd force. That wrench in the tree was the last warning that it was playing with us. It was not just brute force. There was something deliberate, as if he wanted to make us terrified. We continued walking, but now in total silence, with each of us looking over our shoulder every few seconds. The snow began to get deeper, making our steps difficult, and the feeling of being followed became more intense. It was then that we heard again that horrible sound. The scream moaning echoed through the forest. But this time, it seemed to be coming from several places at the same time. It was impossible to know where he was or how many there were. When we finally saw the beginning of a trail that should take us out of the area, we saw something that made everyone stop. In the snow, right in the middle of the road, there was a trail. But it wasn't just footprints this time. They looked like marks of something that had been dragged, as if a huge body had been pulled into the forest. They were going in the direction oriented to ours, which was a small gap, but enough to make our marks speed up the step. The silence returned, but now it was even denser, as if even the children of the forest had disappeared. Each step seemed an invitation to that reappear. As we followed the trail, the snow began to fall heavier, making the walk even more difficult. It seemed that the very climate was conspiring against us. The trail we saw before was far between the trees, but the feeling of being observed was not. The sound of our steps in the snow seemed amplified, as if something wanted to remind us that there was no way to hide. Then Mike suddenly stopped and reached out for silence. We all froze, literally and figuratively. He pointed to the forest on our right, and there, among the trees, was that. This time we see more clearly. It was tall, very tall, and thin in a way that seemed impossible, almost as if it had been stretched. The gray skin looked white, difficult to tell with dim light. The eyes shone unnaturally, and he did not move, just watched us. The thing was there for a few seconds, but those seconds seemed like hours. Then, with a movement so fast I could barely keep up, I was pulled away between the trees. Nobody said anything. We just kept walking, almost running. The only thought in my mind was that we needed to get out of there before it got dark again. The snow did not give respite, and fatigue began to strike us. Our feet were soaked, and the cold seemed to infiltrate right into the bones. Even so, we did not stop. Every branch snapped, every shadow that seemed to move around us was a reminder that it was still watching us, watching. It was then that we looked for a narrow, old and snow-covered bridge. It was the only way to cross a small frozen stream. While Tom crossed first to test the structure, the sound came back. This time louder, as if it was surrounding us. The moaning scream seemed to reverberate inside my head, and I could feel the accelerated breathing. It was impossible not to think that it was playing with us, without keeping any limits. When they all crossed the bridge, something made us look back. There he was again, on the other side of the stream. Only now it seemed bigger, closer. I don't know if it was the cold or pure terror, but I could barely move. Mike, always the calmest, courted silence with a run. And that's what we did. Each ran as they could, slipping and tripping in the snow. I felt the weight of fear on my back, as if at any moment it would reach us. But the sound stopped. The scream suddenly ceased, and when we looked back, it was no longer there. Only the bridge, covered with snow, as if nothing had happened. We kept running, without looking back, until finally we saw what seemed to be the outline of some buildings on the horizon. It was a small village, but at that moment it seemed like a miracle. Everyone was exhausted, faces frozen by the cold and lungs burning. As we approached, the outbreak began to arise, but no one said anything. It seemed like anything could bring him back. When we finally reached the first houses, we saw that it was a nearly deserted village, with only some faint lights coming from windows. We managed to find a place to shelter us, a kind of empty but safe guard post. For the first time in hours, we sat down and took a deep breath. As we tried to warm up, the silence was finally broken. Mike said something that still echoes in my mind. "This is not over." He let us go. That sentence killed any sense of security we had. That was it. We did not escape because we were faster or smarter. We escaped because we wanted to. Looking back now, I keep thinking what that really was and why it seems so intelligent, almost human. Even after weeks, nobody talked about what happened. No official reports were reported, and we did not return to the site. But sometimes I still dream of screaming in the forest, and according to the feeling that I am being watched. The gap in the research laboratory. I arrived at the laboratory around 8 o'clock in the morning. It was a discreet building, almost without windows, surrounded by open fields and some scattered trees. You know that kind of place that seems designed to nobody notice? It was exactly the feeling I had. The supervisor who called me the night before said it was just a security glitch, and I was used to calls like that. Usually it was something simple like disabled sensors or cameras off. But when I got there, I noticed that something was wrong. The parking lot was empty, except for a private security car parked near the entrance. No movement, no reception. I had to use my temporary badge to enter. Inside, the silence was almost palpable. The fluorescent lights were buzzing quietly, but there was no human sound, no steps, no voices. At the reception desk, a handwritten message read, "Evacuated. Wait for instructions." Though strange because no one had evacuation reference in the call. As I walked through the corridors, I noticed that some doors were locked with active containment level warnings. I thought it was some standard procedure, maybe related to the runaway animal that the supervisor is a suspect. But honestly, the atmosphere was heavy, and I started to feel watched, even though I knew there was no one there. I headed to the server room, where the problem apparently began. It was a room in the basement, cold and illuminated by those white lights that make everything seem more sinister. When I went in, I noticed that the monitors were off, as if the whole system had been shut down by force. I took my tools and learned to check the cables and connections. It was then that I noticed something strange. The wires were not just loose, they had been torn. It didn't seem the work of someone inexperienced, but also not professional sabotage. The ends of the cables were crumpled, as if something had crushed them with brute force. While I was analyzing the damage, I heard a sound coming from the corridor. It was light, almost a drag, but had a rhythm that was not human. I froze in place for a few seconds, trying to convince myself that it was just the ventilation or some equipment malfunctioning. When the sound stopped, I created courage and went to the door. The corridor was empty, but the feeling of being lent came back with full force. The absolute silence only made it worse. I closed the door and traveled inside, trying to focus on work. But now my mind was alert to every little noise or movement around me. I continued working, but I could not get out of my head what I had heard. Everything there seemed wrong, as if the whole place was related to breathing. After about 15 minutes, I was able to restart part of the system, and the cameras started working. I was relieved for a second, until I saw the images. Most of the rooms were empty, as I expected, but one of them, marked Beta Containment Area, caught my attention. The glass of one of the inner windows was shattered, with marks of something that looked like claws or teeth on the back of the frame. The camera showed the corridor outside the containment, and what I saw froze to the bone. There were deep wounds on the walls, and the floor was stained with something that looked like dried blood. While I was watching, the camera gave a little bump and focused on something that moved at the end of the corridor. It was fast, almost impossible to follow, but I could see a glimpse. It was large, much larger than a human being, and moved with an agility that made no sense for the size. I could not distinguish many details, but I could see that it was not an ordinary animal. My heart went crazy, and my first occurrence was to get out of there. I grabbed my things and tried to open the door, but the automatic system blocked it. A message on the dashboard said, "Isolation protocol enabled. Permission denied." It was as if the whole building had planned that I would be a threat too. I tried to keep my cool, but it was impossible. He was stuck in the server room with that loose somewhere in the building. My only contact with what was happening were the cameras. I started to switch between them, trying to understand the situation. Some were out of the air, but others showed the same signs: broken corridors, broken doors, and scratches everywhere. In one of the images, I saw what appeared to be a blood trail leading to a room marked Main Laboratory. I tried not to think about what might have happened there, but it was obvious that the runaway animal was not just an animal. Something much more important was that I got out of control. While I was trying to make a plan, the sound came back. This time it was louder, closer. It looked like a drag, but there was something irregular, as if whatever was limping or deliberately trying to make noise. The feeling of being present returned, and I knew that I was not alone. I looked at the camera that monitored the corridor just outside the server room, and my stomach collapsed. The creature was standing there, right in front of the door. It was huge, with an almost translucent skin that seemed to pulsate in some points, as if something moved underneath it. The eyes, I can't explain, but they were intelligent, much more than they should be. I didn't know if I could think of how to escape, or just pray for what I couldn't find. I was still, almost without breathing, as I watched the creature through the cameras. She didn't move, just stood there, as if she knew I was on the other side of the door. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold a flashlight. I thought I'd make some noise to distract her, but what if it just made things worse? The creepy sound of metal squealing brought me back to reality. The thing began to scratch the door slowly, as if testing the resistance. Each blow made the structure vibrate, and my panic only increased. I think very fast. I looked for some alternative exit, but the room was small and had only that one door. The ventilation system was too narrow for me to pass. While desperately searching for a solution, I heard the sound of the steps to stop. I looked at the camera again, but the creature had disappeared. The hallway was empty. That should have given me a break, but the opposite happened. The idea of not knowing where she was even worse. Took one of my heaviest tools, a wrench, and prepared for the worst. I tried to open the door slowly, praying that it was still locked, but to my surprise, it slipped with a click. The protocol had been disabled. It was not a coincidence, and I knew that. With the door open, I peeked in the corridor, trying not to make a noise. Everything seemed too quiet, but the air was charged as if something was lurking. I started walking slowly, holding the wrench in my hand, as if it could protect me against something so monstrous. Each step seemed to echo louder than normal, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to go to the main lab, where I had seen the blood trail through the cameras. It wasn't exactly a smart choice, but standing still seemed even worse. When I got close to the room, I smelled a strong metallic smell. I opened the door carefully and almost threw up. The floor was covered in dried blood, and what appeared to be a safety uniform was touched in a corner, torn like paper. There was no sign of a person wearing it, only the remains of what appeared to be destroyed containment equipment. In the center of the room, a giant glass capsule was open, with deep scratches all over the surface. It seemed that it had been designed to secure something extremely dangerous, but clearly it was not enough. My heart sank when I realized that whatever it wasn't accidentally loose. There was someone open in that capsule. I started to put the pieces together in my head while analyzing the room. Whatever happened in that capsule was not a mere accident. It was an experiment, something that should never have left that place. The blood trail led to a second door at the back of the lab, which was open just enough to leave a visible crack. The light coming from inside blinked irregularly, creating disturbing shadows. My instinct was not to go there, but I had no choice. If there was any chance of understanding what was happening, it would be everything. I pushed the door slowly, and what I saw on the other side seemed like a nightmare. It was a smaller room, full of equipment that I did not know how to identify. In the center, there was a console with broken monitors and static screens. On the floor, one of the scientists fell. At least, I think it was a scientist. He was in a lab coat, but the body looked wrong. The arms were twisted in an unnatural way, and the face had deep marks, as if it had been scratched by something with huge claws. Worse, the walls were covered with handwritten messages, scribbled with something red, which I expected to be painted but knew it wasn't. The words were disconnected. Control lost. Do not open. He knows. As I tried to process what I was selling, I felt a cold stream of air pass through the room. It was not just the normal cold of the lab. It was something that left me with the feeling that the air was being sucked in. I looked back instinctively and saw the door closing slowly, as if something invisible was pushing. I ran to hold her, but before I could reach her, she slammed with a bang. Stood there, trying to hear something other than the sound of my heart pounding. That's when I noticed that the room was completely silent. Neither the hum of equipment nor the sound of lights, just a crushing void. Then the sound came back. It was not loud, but it was enough to make my stomach turn. Steps. Slowly but deliberately, coming from the corridor on the other side of the door. Took the wrench with both hands, trying to prepare for whatever was on the other side. The steps stopped right in front of the door, and everything was silent again. But the feeling that something was there waiting was almost unbearable. I began to retreat to the back of the room, without taking my eyes from the door. It was when I heard the most disturbing sound of all, the breath. Fast, irregular, but deeply intelligent, as if it was evaluating what it would do to me next. I was paralyzed, every muscle of my body tense while listening to that breath. It was impossible to ignore the intelligence behind the sound, as if it were deliberating, almost playing with my occurrence. The door didn't open, but I saw the handle move slightly, as if something was testing the mechanism. At that moment, the only thing that was going through my head was that I was cornered. You looked around, desperate, looking for any way out. That's when I noticed a small trapdoor on the floor, almost hidden under a table turned over. I did not think twice. I ran to him and pulled with all the force I had. The doorway opened with a loud creak, which made the breath on the other side of the door stop. Knew I had caught the creature's attention, so I rushed in and closed the lid above me. The fall was not so high, but the impact left me disoriented for a few seconds. When I got up, I realized that I was in a maintenance tunnel, probably used for emergencies. The lighting was minimal, only a few lights flashing at long intervals. The sound above me continued, but now it was different. It seemed that something was walking around the lab, looking for me. I started moving through the tunnel, trying to be as quiet as possible, but every step of mine felt like thunder in my head. The tunnel seemed endless, and the air inside was heavy, almost suffocating. The flashing lights didn't help. Every time everything was dark for a moment, I felt that something could appear right in front of me. As I advanced, I heard the metallic sound of something that moved above me, as if a creature was following my steps but on the floor of the laboratory. She didn't know how, but she seemed to know exactly where I was. The feeling of being hunted was unbearable. My heart was beating so fast I could barely think straight. All I wanted to do was find a way out. After a few minutes that seemed hours, I found a ladder leading to another hatch above. Didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stand there in the tunnel. I went up slowly, trying not to make a noise, and pushed the lid carefully. When I put my head out, I saw that I was in a room that seemed to be monitoring. There were several screens connected, showing cameras from the whole laboratory. Some were static, others showed images of destroyed corridors and blood-covered rooms. A camera caught my attention. It showed the tunnel from where I had just come out. On the screen, I saw something huge going through the corridor, but it was not just the size that scared me. It was the way it moved, as if it was tracking something almost predatory. As I watched the scene through the camera, I realized that a creature was following exactly the path I had taken in the tunnel. She did not move in a consulted way. Each step seemed calculated, as if she was tracking the smell or hearing the echoes I left behind. I quickly turned off the monitor, fearing that the brightness might reveal me somehow. In the room, there was a main control panel with a large screen showing a map of the laboratory. I located my position and saw that there was an emergency exit a few meters from where I was, but the path was straight, without other escape routes. If that saw me, it would be the end. I took courage and opened the door of the room slowly, making sure that the corridor was empty. I started walking towards the exit, moving as fast and quietly as possible. Each step seemed to bring me closer to freedom, but also to an imminent danger. As I was almost reaching the emergency door, I heard a sound that made my whole body freeze. The same drag from before, now coming from the corridor behind me. I didn't have to look to know that a creature was there, and I knew I had no time to open the door calmly. I ran like never before, threw my body against the door, and fell outside in the snow. When I fell in the snow, the shock of the cold against my body was so intense that I almost lost my breath. The door behind me was still open, and I knew it would not take long to reach me. Looked around desperately, trying to find somewhere to hide or anything that I could use as a weapon. The laboratory was in a remote area, surrounded by trees and mountains, and the silence outside was as oppressive as inside. I decided to run into the forest, hoping that the density of trees would hinder the creature's movement. As I ran, I heard the sound of the emergency door opening with a bang, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crushing the snow. Didn't want to look back, but curiosity and fear got the better of me. For a split second I saw it come out of the building. It was even worse in daylight. His body looked elongated, as if the muscles remained in constant tension, ready to die at speed. The eyes, which I had only seen through the cameras, shone with an intensity that seemed to cross me. Do not know how, but I was able to accelerate even with the legs almost giving way. As he ran through the forest, the sound of the creature's footsteps seemed to get closer. She wasn't just chasing me. It was like she was joking, letting me run, and then catching up to me. My vision was clouded by sweat and cold, and every breath seemed to tear up my lungs. I knew it wouldn't last long. It was then that I tripped on a root and fell with everything in the snow. The impact was strong, and for a moment I managed that I would not be able to lift. The sound of footsteps stopped, and silence took over. I knew she was close. I raised my head slowly and saw something in the trees. The creature was there, watching me. She did not move, did nothing, just stood still, as if he was evaluating what he would do to me. My mind was in panic, trying to find some logic in that behavior. It was when a distant sound made silence, the noise of helicopters. Do not know where it came from, but the creature turned his head quickly, as if he had heard too. Without warning, she jumped back and disappeared into the forest, moving with an absurd speed. I stood there motionless until the presidents appeared above me, lighting up the area with spotlights. The helicopters paired up above me, and a team of men quickly descended, wearing uniforms that had no visible identification. They were organized and showed no surprise or hesitation, as if they knew exactly what they were facing. One of them came to me and told me without saying anything, while another pointed a gun towards the forest. I was taken to one of the helicopters without any explanation. My attempts to ask what was going on were completely ignored. While I was placed inside the aircraft, I saw that other members of the team were setting up some kind of barrier on the perimeter of the forest. During the flight, no one said a word. I was sitting still, shaking, trying to understand what had just happened. The pilot seemed to be in constant radio communication, but spoke in codes that he could not understand. When we finally landed in a place that looked like a temporary base, I was escorted to an isolated room. A man with a serious and cold look came in and just said, "You didn't see anything." This never happened. They took my equipment, including my cell phone, and sent me away with a warning not to talk about what happened. Since then, I can't get what I saw in that lab out of my head. Don't know what that thing was or why they were so prepared to deal with it, but one thing is certain. It wasn't human, and someone knew exactly what was loose there. The escape in the night. I will never forget that night. We were coming back from a weekend trip, crossing a deserted road that seemed endless. It was late, and the children were already napping in the back seat. My husband, Blake, was driving, and I was in the passenger seat trying to keep my eyes open. There was nothing around, only dense and dark trees on both sides. Everything seemed normal until someone crossed the road right in front of us. It was fast, so fast that we couldn't even understand what it was. Blake turned the wheel sharply to swerve, and that's when everything got out of control. The car skidded on the wet track, went off the road, and hit something that looked like a ravine. The impact was so strong that I was stunned for a few seconds. When I regained consciousness, I heard the sound of the engine still running, squealing, and the children's crying in the background. Blake was sitting motionless on the wheel, breathing heavily. "Is everyone all right?" he asked, trying not to panic. My heart was racing, but it seemed that no one had been hurt badly. The car was destroyed. There was no way to put it back on the road. Blake went out to assess the damage while I tried to laugh at the children. But that's when something started to look wrong. He was taking too long outside. I looked out the window and saw him standing, staring at the forest, as if he was trying to see something in the trees. I called Blake, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, facing the darkness. Finally, he went back to the car, but it was strange. "There's no turning back now. We'll have to walk until we find help," he said, but his voice was different, colder, almost without emotion. We took some essential things, lanterns, coats, and a bottle of water that we have no car. The children were scared, and I tried to keep calm, even with that feeling that something was wrong. We started walking down the road, but it seemed that the silence around us was suffocating. There were no sounds of insects or wind, just the sound of our steps and accelerated breaths. After about 20 minutes walking, we heard a noise coming from the forest. It was a loud snap, as if someone had stepped on a dry branch. We all froze. Blake pointed a flashlight in the direction of the sound, but we saw nothing. "Probably an animal," he said, not looking very complimented. We continued walking, but the noises did not stop. It was as if something was following us, keeping distance, but not too far. Every minute, we heard more branches breaking and leaves being moved, always coming from different places. The children were crying, and my stomach was upset. Blake held on, but there was something in his way that made me suspicious. He seemed too calm. The situation became even more tense when Blake began to act strangely. He was leading the group, but suddenly stopped in the middle of the road and looked at the forest again. This time he whispered something I couldn't understand. "Blake, are you okay?" she asked, but he didn't answer immediately. He just turned his head slowly, with an empty look, as if he did not allow me. It shivered me to the bone. The children were restless, and I could feel fear growing in them, even without understanding exactly what was happening. Soon after, he said, "Follow me." His voice was so firm, but it wasn't the Blake I knew. He started a walk towards the forest, leaving a road behind. I tried to hold him by the arm, saying we should continue on the road until we find help, but he ignored me completely. "We have no choice," was all he said before disappearing into the trees. With the children clinging to me, I didn't know what to do. Being on the road seemed safer, but at the same time, I couldn't leave Blake alone. Against my instinct, I decided to follow him, hoping that he knew what he was doing. Entering the forest was like crossing a threshold to another world. The darkness there was suffocating, and the lanterns could only light up a few meters ahead. The trees seemed to close the way, and the silence was different, heavy, almost as if the forest itself were watching us. Blake kept walking, steady, not looking back. I called him, but he didn't answer. The children were clinging to me, crying softly, and I could barely keep my cool. Then I heard again the sound of something moving, how much closer. It was like steps, but erratic, too fast to be human. I tried to call Blake again, this time louder. "Blake, wait! You hear me? You're scaring me." He finally stopped, but what happened next scared me. He turned his face to me, but his eyes focused, different. I can't explain right, but there was something wrong, something that was not natural. "Don't stop walking," he said, with a voice that sounded more grave than usual. It was almost an order, as if he knew something we didn't know. Before I could answer, a loud ecological snap or through the forest, followed by a sound that sounded like a deep grunting coming from all sides. I was sure that at that moment we were not alone. The grunt made my blood cold. The children began to cry louder, and I held them tightly, tempting them with something they didn't even know what it was. Blake didn't seem a bit shaken. In fact, he seemed almost alien, as if he was in another world. "Keep walking," he repeated, this time more firmly. I wanted to scream, ask him to stop and tell me what was going on, but something in his tone made me obey. We started to walk faster, but the children continued to surround us, as if something was hunting us. Branches were cracking, leaves were being dragged, and every second, the feeling of being watched increased. Suddenly, Blake stopped again, but this time he said the hand, as if he wanted us to be quiet. He stared at something in front of us, and when he followed his look with the lantern, I saw. There was a silhouette in the middle of the trees, large and still, but clearly alive. It was not an ordinary animal, I was sure of that. The creature looked humanoid, but there was something wrong with its shape, as if the limbs were too much. My breath stuck in my throat as I tried to understand what I was selling. Before he could react, Blake took a step forward, as if he was going toward that. "Blake, no!" I shouted, but he did not stop. Blake continued walking towards the creature, as if being attracted by some invisible force. That's when you realized he was holding something he hadn't noticed before, a knife. Where did he get it? No sense. "Blake, back. Please." I cried, but he didn't turn around. The creature was found motionless, but now I could see more details as the lantern flickered in my hand. Her skin looks uneven, almost like waterfalls of trees, but it breathed, expanding and contracting in a way that made me nauseous. Then suddenly she moved too fast for something this size. It didn't come towards us, but was driven away among the trees, leaving only that deep grunt in the air. Blake stopped where he was, looking into the void, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then he turned to us, and my heart sank. There was something in his eyes that was not human. He started walking back towards us, but in a strange, almost mechanical way. I instinctively backed away, holding the children, but he just declared the knife and said, "We need to go deeper." It was at that moment I realized the danger wasn't just in the forest. Blake wasn't the same anymore, and I didn't know what to do. To be risking my life and the children's, but running out seemed like a death sentence. As Blake approached, my whole body trembled. He seemed determined, but not the man I knew. The steps were calculated, the eyes fixed, as if being controlled by something. The children were crying louder, and I knew I had to do something. With a quick movement, I caught a thick branch on the ground without thinking much. "Blake, please stop. You're scaring us." But he completely ignored it. When he took another step, I raised the branch and threatened, "Don't come any closer." He stopped, but what he said afterwards left me terrified. "You don't understand. They're already inside me. Don't fight against it." His words echoed in my mind like a nightmare. It was then that I heard again the branches breaking around us, but this time it was more intense, closer. The creature, or whatever it was coming back. Blake took a step back, as if he was hearing something I couldn't hear. "You have to go. Now," he said, suddenly with the voice more like his but still different enough to be scary. Before I could react, he ran in the opposite direction, into the darkness, leaving the knife as if to see it alone. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, but I knew he wouldn't come back. I took the kids and ran in the opposite direction, not looking back. I ran like never before, holding the children so hard that my arms started to do. The forest seemed endless, and every sound around me seemed closer, as if something was surrounding us. My heart was racing, and I could hardly think. All that mattered was getting out of there. Finally, I saw a small open field with an old hut in the middle. It wasn't much, but it seemed to be the only shelter available. I ran there, pushed the door that was just leaning back, and went in with the children, locking it behind me. The cabin interior was dark and smelled of mold, but at least we were outside the forest. The children were exhausted and wept softly, while I tried to catch my breath. Then I heard that grunt again, but this time it seemed more distant. For a moment, I thought we were safe, but as I lit the hut with the lantern, I saw something that made my blood cold. There were deep claw marks on the wood, and on the ground, something that looked like dried blood stains. We weren't the first to hide there. The sense of security was absent, and all I could do was pray that it would not find us. Time seemed to have stopped in that hut. I kept the lantern pointed at the door, hoping to hear any sign that something was approaching. The children were huddled in a corner, too exhausted to say anything, but I could see the fear in their eyes. The forest outside was silent, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was a silence, as if nature itself was heavy waiting for something to happen. And then I heard a low, almost imperceptible sound, steps. But they did not come from the forest, they were inside the hut. I turned slowly, trying to hold the lantern steady, but my hands trembled so much that the beam of light danced through the walls. At the back of the room, I saw something that seemed to move. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then I realized what it was. A figure was crouching in the darkest corner of the hut. It was not human. His eyes shone in a way that seemed unnatural, reflecting the light of the lantern. Before I could react, the thing released a sound, a low and prolonged grunting, which reverberated inside me as a warning. The door behind me began to vibrate, as if something outside was trying to enter too. I was surrounded, and there was nowhere to run. My mind panicked. I was caught between that thing in the corner and whatever was trying to break down the door. The children started crying again, but my body reacted before I could think. I took the branch that was still with me and positioned the children behind me, trying to protect them from something that seemed impossible to protect. The figure in the corner started to rise, and I finally got to see its size. It was huge, but thin, as if every bone was about to pierce the skin. She took a slow step forward, and the sound of her nails scratching the ground still echoes in my head to this day. Before I could get any closer, the door behind me opened with a bang. The force was so great that it almost knocked us down. I turned around fast enough to see what it looked like. Blake. But it wasn't him. His face was pale, his eyes completely dark, without any human brightness. He drove straight to me and said something that I did not understand until now, as if it were in another language. The creature in the corner stopped and turned its head slowly toward Blake. It was as if they were registering. Suddenly, both started moving towards me at the same time. The only thing I could do was grab the kids and run through the door without looking back. I ran aimlessly through the forest, with children clinging to me and tears running down my face. The cold of the night cut my skin, but I could only think to keep moving. Behind us, the children were indescribable. They sounded like grunts, steps, and a kind of murmur that I could not understand. It was all mixed up, and it was impossible to know if Blake or that creature was still chasing us. The only thing I knew was that we couldn't stop. Every broken branch under my feet seemed to echo like a scream in the night, denouncing me. Finally, I saw lights in the distance, fights, but enough to rekindle a little hope. It seemed to be a road. I got there with the children, exhausted and almost without strength. I threw myself on the asphalt, signaling for the first car that appeared. A truck finally stopped, and the driver got off, confused but clearly scared to see our state. I can't explain anything, I just begged for help. He put us in the cabin and started driving. When I looked back into the forest, I saw something moving between the trees, but it was too fast to identify. I'm not sure if it was my imagination or there really was something there. But since that night, I haven't seen Blake. And honestly, I don't know if I want to find out what happened to him. The Silver Creek Werewolf. It was a stuffy summer night in 1956 in the heart of Texas, when my father decided it would be a good idea to go fishing at Silver Creek. The harvest of the farm was over, and he thought a night on the river would do us good. I was 14 at the time, and the idea of spending a night outdoors, just the two of us, seemed exciting. We took our gear, some flashlights, and my dad's old rifle, in case of a coyote or something, he said. The moon was full, illuminating the path to the river, and the sound of crickets was constant, almost comforting. We arrived at the site around 9 o'clock in the evening, set up our camp, and started fishing. For a while, everything was exactly as I expected. Quiet, with my father telling stories and the sound of water running softly. But things started to change around midnight. The dog we took with us, a mongrel named Buck, began acting strange. He snarled at nothing, his hair on the back of the neck shriveled. My father thought it might be some animal in the woods, but the more time passed, the more restless Buck was. Even the horses that were tied near the camp began to shake, pulling their ideas and groaning softly. I tried to ignore it, thinking that maybe it was just my imagination, but there was something in the air that made my skin crawl. It was as if the silence itself had changed, becoming heavier, more oppressive. My father also found out. He made an offer, took the rifle, and looked out into the woods, as if he expected something to come out of there at any moment. Time seemed to have slowed down. My father appeared standing with his rifle, eyes fixed on the line of trees while I tried to laugh at Buck, who now barked nonstop. "Something's wrong," he muttered, almost to himself. Until then, I had never seen my father in fear, and the fact that he was so tense only added to my own panic. It was then we heard. A low sound, like a deep growl, echoed through the forest. It was not a natural sound, that I was sure. I don't look like a coyote, or any other animal I know. Buck stopped barking suddenly and started to back, sticking his tail between his legs. Even the horses were in complete silence now, but their nostrils trembled, as if they felt something in the air. My father took a few steps forward, lifting his rifle while I stood behind him, holding a flickering lantern in my hand. The sound of growling increased, coming from a specific point in the forest. The moonlight seemed not to reach that place, and even with the lantern, it was impossible to see what was hidden among the trees. Then we saw the movement. Something big mixed in between the bushes, too fast for us to identify ourselves. My father mentioned the rifle, but before he could shoot, something advanced. It happened so fast that I barely had time to react. A creature emerged from the darkness, but not completely. I saw only a glimpse, thin eyes like those of an animal, but intelligent, almost human. My father shot, and the sound of the shot echoed through the forest, but the thing did not stop. It moved so fast that it looked like a blur in the darkness. Buck started barking again, but this time it was a high-pitched, desperate bark. The creature was circling around the camp, and all we could see were flashes of movement in the shadows. My father screamed for me to climb one of the nearby trees, but I couldn't move. It was as if fear had frozen me. Finally, he pulled me by the arm and practically threw me up the tree while he stood there with his rifle pointed. From above, you can have a broader view, but it only makes things worse. I saw the creature stop for a moment among the trees, and my heart almost stopped. It was huge, much bigger than any animal I had ever seen. It looked like a wolf, but not completely. The paws were too big, and the way he moved was wrong, almost like a man trying to walk on all fours. The eyes were bright, fixed on my father, who kept his gun pointed. Buck, in an act of courage or despair, ran towards the creature, but was knocked down with a single blow. He let out a hiss and fell motionless to the ground. I could not scream, could do nothing, just watch. After Buck fell, my father fired again, but it seemed useless. The thing did not even back, just moved to the side, as if it was having fun surrounding us. It was then that she released a sound I will never forget. It was not a common growl. It was something guttural, almost like a cry mixed with laughter, but distorted and human. My ears were ringing, and the sound seemed to enter my head, making my heart soar even more. My father screamed for me to stay where he was and started to back towards the tree, but I knew he had no chance if that thing decided to attack him. It was at that moment that the creature finally came out of the shadows completely. The moonlight illuminated its form, and I wished I had never seen it. He was like a wolf, but erect, with huge muscles and front legs that resembled human arms, only they ended in sharp claws. The mouth was full of long, uneven teeth, and the fur looked dirty, stained with something that could be blood. The eyes were shining in an unnatural way, as if they had lives of their own. My father stopped for a moment, as if trying to process what he was seeing, and I could see the fear in his eyes. He had never shown fear before, but there, that night, he seemed as lost as I. My father, even terrified, did something I will never forget. He raised his rifle with firm hands and shouted to the creature, "Oh, disgrace! Come! It was as if he wanted to give me time to run away, even though he knew that he was completely out of his league. The creature bowed its head, as if studying my father, and then took a step forward. It was when he shot again, straight into her chest. This time the thing retreated, releasing a roar so loud that it seemed to make the ground shake. For a second, I thought the shot worked, but then I realized it was just anger. She was angry, and now it was worse. Without thinking twice, my father cried out for me to come down and run to the nearest horse. My mind was in chaos, but I obeyed. I slipped down the tree and ran, almost stumbling at every step. The sound of the thing running behind me was indescribable, like thunder mixed with the sound of wood being broken. Before I got on the horse, I looked back and saw my father fighting with her. He used the rifle as a stick, trying to push away the claws, but the thing was too fast. The last image I had of him was that, a man facing something that should not exist, while I rode on the horse and gave the command to run. The sound of the hooves was the only thing that kept me conscious, while tears flowed from my face. My father, even visibly scared, did something that marked me forever. He raised his rifle firmly and shouted at the creature, trying to push it away. The thing stopped for a moment, as if it was assessing the situation, and took a step forward, his eyes shining in the dark. It was when he fired again, and the sound echoed through the forest. This time, the creature backed away, releasing a grave and guttural sound, like a scream mixed with a roar. The tension in the air was unbearable, and everything seemed to happen in slow motion. My father gestured for me to come down from the tree and go towards the horses. With my heart racing, I did what he asked. I quickly went down and started running, feeling every step as if I was carrying lead in my feet. The sound of the forest seemed alive, with branches cracking and leaves being dragged. When I got to the nearest horse, the reins were loose, and he was shaking as if he was also terrified. I managed to ride it and give the command to run, while my father was behind, holding his rifle and shouting something I could not understand. I didn't have the courage to look back. The sound of the hooves hitting the ground was the only thing that gave me a little hope as I walked away from camp. The horse ran down the trail as if he knew his life also depended on it. My eyes were full of tears, but I had no time to think or process what was happening. The sound of the forest behind me seemed increasingly distant, but the feeling of being pursued did not abandon me. I reached a point where the trail split, and for a moment I hesitated, trying to remember which direction it would lead back to the farm. I chose the right path, but panic made me wonder if I had chosen wrong. After a few minutes that seemed hours, I saw the dim lights of the neighboring farm. It was like seeing a mirage in the middle of chaos. I got off the horse before he even stopped and ran towards the main house, slamming the door with all my might. The rancher opened, confused and drowsy, but seeing my state, he let me in without hesitation. Between short breaths and words trampled, I tried to explain what had happened. He seemed skeptical, but not completely unbelieving, as if he had heard similar stories before. He told me to wait while he went to get the phone to call for help, but his expression showed that he knew something was wrong that night. While I was waiting in the rancher's room, I started hearing strange sounds outside. It was hard to know if it was my mind playing tricks or if there really was something coming. The rancher came back, holding a rifle instead of the phone. "The line is off. It never happens," he said, with a tone that mixed nervousness and determination. He locked the door and closed all the windows, something that made me even more anxious. "You said you saw something in the river? Describe it again." When I started talking, he interrupted me, mumbling something like, "I knew that was real." Then I heard a loud noise, as if something heavy had fallen into the barn outside. The rancher froze for a moment, and then approached the window, moving only the curtain enough to spy. His expression changed immediately, and he whispered, "You stay here. Don't open this door for anyone, understand?" Before I could answer, he left the back door, leaving his shotgun against the wall. I stood still, not knowing what to do, until the sound of something scratching the wood of the barn broke the silence. My instinct was that I needed to run, but my body didn't move. That's when I realized the creature was closer than I thought. The outside noises became more intense, as if something was circulating around the house. The sound of claws scratching the wood mixed with heavy steps on the earth, and my heart pounded at every moment. I tried to convince myself that the rancher knew what he was doing, but the silence that came soon after made me even more terrified. Went out near the door and hid behind the furniture in the room, trying as much as possible not to make noise. Could hear my breath, short and panting, as I tried to control the panic. It was then that I heard a bang at the front door, followed by another stronger. Something was trying to get in. It was not a simple animal, I was sure of that. Each beat seemed more calculated, almost as if it were a person trying to force the entry. My whole body was shaking, and all I could do was shrink even more, waiting for the thing to give up. But instead, I heard the most terrifying sound, a deep breath, as if the creature was right there, on the other side of the door, sniffing. Don't know if she could feel me, but my survival instinct told me I couldn't stay there much longer. I knew I had to get out of there, but the fear held me like an anchor. The heavy breathing on the other side of the door became more irregular, as if the thing was getting closer and closer to finding out where I was. It was then that a bang echoed, and the front door partially gave out, as if something had hit her with force. The wood cracked, and a huge claw appeared from the hole, trying to force its way in. I was paralyzed for a few seconds before I remembered the shotgun that the rancher had left against the wall. I ran to the rifle, almost tripping on the furniture, and held it tightly. I had never used a gun before, but at that moment, I had no choice. The creature pushed once more, and the door practically exploded inside, throwing pieces of wood all over the room. Finally, I saw it. The creature squeezed through the doorway, half inside the house, half outside. It was even more terrifying under the light of the lamps. His eyes shone insanely, and his claws seemed capable of tearing anything. Without thinking, I pointed at her and pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was deafening, and the thing released a scream that seemed to mix pain and anger. She backed off, but not for long. The creature took a few steps back, but did not seem defeated. The cry she uttered still echoed in my ears, and it was impossible to tell if I had really hurt her or just angered her even more. She stared at me with those bright eyes, full of a frightening intelligence, while the blood dripped from a wound on her shoulder. It was not like normal blood. It seemed thicker, almost black, and dripped on the ground, forming small puddles. Before I could decide my next move, the thing let out another roar and advanced again, this time with even more fury. Without thinking, I ran to the kitchen, holding the rifle as if it was my only salvation. Behind me, I heard the sound of furniture being destroyed as the creature chased me. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely carry the gun, but I managed to put another bullet in the barrel in time. When the thing entered the kitchen, I pointed again and shot. The shot hit her chest, and this time the creature fell backwards, hitting the wall with enough force to make the house shake. She didn't move for a few seconds, and I used that time to run towards the back door, not worrying about anything but escaping. The creature retreated a few steps after firing, emitting a guttural sound that echoed through the room. Although it looked wounded, it showed no signs of weakening. I didn't know if what I did had caused real damage or just left it more aggressive. For a moment she stood motionless, watching, almost as if she was calculating her next move. I took advantage of this brief pause to move towards the kitchen, trying to keep the rifle steady, although my hands trembled uncontrollably. As I walked away, I heard loud sounds behind me. The creature knocked down furniture and objects on the way, and each step seemed closer. My mind was in chaos, but I managed to load the rifle while running. I reached the kitchen and turned around in time to see her at the entrance, partially illuminated by the dim light of the lamp. I looked and shot again. The shot hit the creature's chest, which staggered backwards, falling against the wall. I did not wait to see if it would rise. I took the moment and ran out the back door, with only one thought in mind: get out of there as soon as possible. I ran out of the house without looking back, the sound of my steps echoing in the silence of the night. The adrenaline was so strong that I could barely hear anything other than my heart beating out of control. The cold outside was sharp, but I couldn't stop. I knew the creature wouldn't stay down for long. I crossed the ranch yard and hid behind a pile of stacked wood, trying to control my breath. It was hard to think, but I knew I needed a plan. As I hid, I heard that sound again, a low growl, almost like a warning. Didn't know if it was coming from near or far, but I couldn't take the chance. I saw the barn in the distance and decided that it would be my best chance. I moved slowly, trying not to make noise, and entered through the side door. The smell of hay and animals was strong, but at least inside there was cover. Went up to the attic of the barn, where the hay was stored, and I hid among the piles. Everything was quiet for a few minutes, but then I heard the door creak. Something was coming in. I was in the attic of the barn, almost without breathing, trying to hear what happened downstairs. The wood of the floor creaked with each movement, and the sound echoed as if the whole place was denouncing me. Could not see through the cracks of the floor, but knew something had come in. I could feel it. The silence was broken by heavy, slow steps, as if the creature was exploring every corner of the barn. The tension was unbearable. Every sound sounded amplified, and I wondered if she could hear me or even smell me. Suddenly, the steps stopped. I was still, with my heart racing, waiting. Then I heard something much more disturbing, a slow, deep breath just below me. She knew I was there. Despair took hold, and I began frantically looking for something that I could use. Had not the shotgun with me. I dropped it as I fled from the house. All I found was a rusty hook used to move hay. I took it as my last defense. The creature began to climb the stairs to the attic, and the sound was like a hammer hitting my sanity. Each step seemed closer. I knew that I had a few seconds to act, or it would be too late. The sound of the steps up the ladder seemed slow, but every second seemed to drag on for hours. My mind was in a whirlwind. Held the rusty hook so hard that my hands began to hurt. He knew that there was no way to face her directly, but running away seemed impossible. I hid behind a pile of hay, trying to control my breath, but it was as if the creature could hear my heart beating. The moonlight came through the cracks of the barn, partially illuminating the attic. That's when I saw it. The creature's head appeared at the top of the ladder. His eyes shone in the dark, and every movement seemed calculated, almost methodical. She went into the attic, sniffing the air. My first reaction was to shrink even more, but I knew it would not work. She moved slowly, exploring every corner, every shadow, until she stopped near where I was hiding. Time seemed to freeze. My mind was screaming for me to do something, but my body was paralyzed by fear. It was when an unexpected sound echoed through the barn, a distant scream coming from the direction of the house. The creature raised his head quickly and, in a swift movement, went down the stairs, disappearing into the darkness. I was paralyzed for a few moments, trying to understand what had just happened. The cry that echoed through the night seemed human, but also had something strange, almost inhuman. Didn't know if it was someone asking for help or some other trap. The creature had gone out, but I didn't feel safe. Still hidden among the piles of hay, I heard her footsteps moving away and silence settling again. The attic looked more oppressive, as if the air had become heavy. I needed to get out of there, but every move seemed a bet with death. I went down from the attic as quietly as possible, trying to avoid the creaks of wood. My whole body was tense, ready to run at any moment. When I reached the barn floor, I noticed that the silence outside was almost absolute, except for the sound of the wind. The scream had stopped, and it made me even more nervous. I peeked through the door open, but could see nothing but darkness and shadows. Didn't know what to do. A part of me wanted to run away, but something told me that I needed to find out what happened to the rancher. It was as if leaving that behind was worse than facing fear. I decided I needed to check the rancher's house. Maybe he was still there, maybe he could have handled it, or maybe not. My mind swung between hope and despair, but curiosity was stronger. Left the barn as quietly as I could, keeping close to the shadows. The wind swung the trees, and every sound seemed amplified. I felt as if something was still watching me, but saw nothing around me. The way to the house seemed longer than before, and each step was a struggle not to run. When I finally arrived, the front door was wide open, as if it had been broken in again. I walked slowly, holding a piece of wood that I found on the way. The silence inside the house was oppressive, as if the place was stuck in another time. The room was destroyed, with furniture turned and claw marks on the walls. In the middle of the mess, I saw dark spots on the floor, but could not identify if it was blood or just the shadow of broken lamps. I called the rancher in a low voice, but there was no answer. I began to explore the rest of the house, each step heavier than the previous. When I got to the kitchen, I saw something that made me stop at the same instant. A hat thrown on the floor and a shotgun next to it, both covered by a dark and sticky substance. The sight of that hat and the shotgun made me freeze. It was obvious that something terrible had happened there, but I still did not know what exactly. The dark substance looked like dry blood, but was thicker, almost like tar. I tried not to touch anything, but the need to find answers made me move on. I passed to the corridor that led to the rooms, feeling every fiber of my body tense, waiting for something to jump out of the shadows at any moment. The doors of the rooms were open, and the furniture was all turned over, as if someone or something had passed by in a frenzy. I got to the last room and saw a scene that made me want to vomit. In the corner, there was a deep mark on the ground, as if something heavy had been dragged. The rancher was not there, but the window was open, with the broken glass out, as if someone had been pulled hard. The air was heavy, with a metallic smell that seemed to infiltrate everything. I stood there, trying to understand what to do, until I heard a sound coming from outside, a slow drag, accompanied by heavy breaths. My heart popped, and I knew it had come back. Without thinking, I hid behind a closet, trying to become invisible as the sound approached more and more. While hiding behind the closet, each sound seemed closer and more threatening. The heavy breath echoed through the corridor, slow and deliberate, as if the creature knew exactly where I was. My whole body was shaking, and I tried to control my breath, but it was almost impossible. The silence that settled between the steps was even more terrifying, as if the creature was playing with my fear. The ground creaked under her weight, each step stronger than the previous. I could feel the strong metallic smell that seemed to accompany it, mixed with the odor of something burned. The sound stopped right at the door of the room, and my mind went into complete chaos. I knew that if she came in, there would be no escape. Closed my eyes and held the piece of wood so hard that my fingers started to hurt. Time seemed to freeze while silence dominated everything. Then I heard a different sound, a distant cry coming from outside, as if someone was calling for help. The creature seemed to hesitate, could hear her movement changing, as if she had decided to go after the sound. After a few seconds, the silence returned, but I knew that I could not stay there. I took the chance and ran out of the broken window without looking back. Jumping out of the window was a desperate impulse. The broken glass scratched my arms, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get out of that house as fast as possible. I fell hard on the ground, but I got up almost immediately and started running. The sky was beginning to clear, with the first light of dawn appearing on the horizon, but the sense of danger was still present. The forest seemed alive around me, every sound mixing with the accelerated beats of my heart. It was as if nature itself was watching what happened. I ran aimlessly, not knowing where I was going, until I reached the creek that passed behind the rancher's house. The water was cold, and the weak current made a sound that for a moment gave me a false sense of security. I stopped to try to catch my breath and understand what to do next. It was then that I heard heavy steps behind me once again. Looked back, and even in the dim light of dawn, I saw the creature. It was standing, watching, but not moving. His eyes still shone, but now there was something different. It wasn't just a predator. It was like he was evaluating me, deciding whether to continue or let me go. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Me and the creature stood there, separated by the stream, as if we were stuck in a silent game. My muscles were tense, ready to run, but something told me that any sudden movement could trigger a fatal reaction. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if trying to understand what I was, or perhaps why I was still there. The glow in her eyes seemed less aggressive, but still deeply strange, almost mesmerizing. I could barely breathe as I stepped forward, touching the water with one of my claws. But then, as if something was distracted, the creature turned its head quickly toward the forest, towards something I could not see. Her whole body became tense, and in an instant she disappeared among the trees, moving too fast for my eyes to follow. I was paralyzed, trying to understand what had just happened. I didn't know if that meant I was safe, or if it was just a pause before the next attack. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there. I decided to follow the course of the stream, hoping that it would take me back to some familiar place, or at least away from that nightmare. Following the stream was my only option. The cold water running through the rocks seemed like the only natural sound around me, but I still could not relax. The image of the creature was etched in my mind, and every shadow between the trees seemed to move, reminding me that I was not completely out of danger. My body was exhausted, but the adrenaline kept me moving. The sun was rising, and the first rays of light created patterns between the leaves, but it still looked strange, as if the forest was waiting for something to happen. After walking for some more time, I saw something that made me almost cry with relief: the wooden fence of our farm. She seemed so familiar, so sure of herself, that for a moment I forgot everything that had happened. I ran as fast as I could, tripping over roots and rocks, until I reached the entrance. When I finally stepped into the yard, I saw my mother on the porch, looking out at the horizon with a worried expression. When she saw me, she ran towards me, asking what had happened and where my father was. I tried to explain, but the words did not come out. All I could do was point to the forest, with tears in my eyes as she hugged me tightly. My mother kept hugging me as I tried to put the words in order to explain what had happened. She looked at me with a mixture of relief and worry, but her expression changed completely when she saw the cuts and scratches on my arms. "What's the matter? Where is your father?" she repeated, but I couldn't answer. Just babbled about the creature, about the rancher, about what we had seen. She seemed to want to believe, but what I was saying was so absurd that even for me it sounded unreal. Suddenly the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the trail coming from the forest. My mother and I looked at the same time, and my heart almost stopped. It was my father. He was walking slowly, his clothes torn and dirty, but no visible sign of serious injuries. He looked exhausted but alive. When he got close enough, I saw something strange in his eyes, something I could not explain. He said nothing, just looked at me and my mother as if he was processing what had happened. That's when he finally broke the silence. "Don't go back to Silver Creek," he said, before entering the house, leaving a heavy silence in the air. We never spoke about that night again, the meeting in the National Forest. I still can't believe what happened that week in the Appalachian National Forest. We were part of a team of biologists studying the migratory patterns of local deer and predators. There were 4 of us: me, Sarah, a mammal expert, Mike, our field leader, and brothers Connor and Dave, who took care of the technical and logistical side. Everything seemed normal in the first days, with signs of wildlife around and relatively quiet conditions for work. But as we explored the area, we started noticing things that just didn't make sense. The first signs were subtle. Deer trails disappeared suddenly, ending in clearings where the soil was completely virgin, without any indication of predators. In other places, we found blood stains on the vegetation, but no traces to show what happened. Mike thought it could be an out-of-the-box predator, maybe a bear or a big cat. However, the marks on the trees were different from anything we had ever seen. They were deep, like claws, but much larger than any animal known in the region. The nights also started to get stranger, with sounds that we cannot identify. It was not ordinary howls, nor the usual noises of a forest at night. It was something more guttural, deep, and echoed in a way that made us feel the sound in our chest. The following nights were even worse. We were all tense, even trying to convince ourselves that it was just some unknown animal or a rare phenomenon. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave us. On the 3rd night, Sarah was the one who noticed something first. We were around the campfire, trying to relax after a long day of data collection, when she stopped in the middle of a sentence. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the camp. We all remained silent. The sound was there again, a deep and prolonged howl, but not like that of a wolf or coyote. It was something bigger, something that looked mistakenly human. Mike was the first to take the lantern and point it at the forest. Nothing. only trees and the dance of light reflected in the leaves. Connor and Dave started checking the perimeter of the camp, while Sarah and I stayed by the fire. The howl repeated itself, this time closer, and I could swear that there was something moving fast among the trees. The air seemed denser, heavier, and the feeling of being observed was almost suffocating. Suddenly we heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling the camp. Mike whispered to all of us together and set up his camera, but whatever it was, it seemed to be playing with us, moving through the shadows before we could see it. The tension in the camp was unbearable. The lanterns swept away the darkness, but all we saw were the shadows of the trees moving in the wind. Sarah held my arm tight, her wide eyes fixed in the direction of the sound. Then Connor yelled, "There!" We all turned in the direction he pointed, but what we saw was only a blur. Something big, much bigger than a bear, passed between the trees so fast that we could not distinguish the shape. Mike tried to capture something with the camera, but it was gone. The silence that followed was even more frightening. The sounds came back minutes later, now closer. It was as if the creature was circling our camp, watching, waiting for the right moment. When we finally got a clearer glimpse, my heart popped. The thing was tall, muscular, but deformed. He had an upright posture, but his movements were almost animalistic. It was not something that should exist. Mike, trying to keep calm, started filming, but before he could do much, the creature released a sound so loud and guttural that it seemed to make the ground shake. Our equipment vibrated, and even the lanterns seemed to fail. It was at that moment that we realized that was not just a common predator, it was something much more dangerous and intelligent. After the deafening scream, the creature disappeared again into the forest, leaving the camp in a suffocating silence. No one could move, as if we were trapped in the pure terror of what we had just witnessed. Mike finally broke the silence, ordering everyone to gather their gear and get ready to leave. But when Connor went to check the vehicle, his scream echoed through the night. We ran to him and saw the worst-case scenario. The tires were destroyed, cut by something so sharp that it looked like a blade. The hood was crumpled, and the engine seemed to have been torn from the inside. We were officially stuck. Dave, trying to keep calm, suggested that we go up the nearby hill to try to get a signal on the portable radio, but when we tried to turn it on, we only heard static. There was no communication. It was as if that thing knew exactly what to do to isolate us. We decided to lock ourselves in the tents and wait until dawn, but the fear was almost palpable. No one could sleep. Every sound, every movement of the wind seemed to be the approaching creature. At about 3 o'clock in the morning we heard the steps again, but this time they were inside the camp. When we left the tents with the lanterns, we realized that our backpacks had disappeared, along with all the food and the rest of the equipment. The feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming. We were without food, equipment, and no way out of that forest. Mike tried to keep the lead, but even he seemed to fall apart. "This is not an ordinary animal," he whispered, almost as if talking to himself. Sarah started to cry silently, and Connor and Dave were discussing what to do next. It became clear that no one had a real solution. As we tried to decide our next move, we heard that guttural sound again, but this time it seemed to be coming from multiple directions. It was as if the creature had surrounded us, or worse, as if there were more than one. Mike decided we needed to get out of camp and find a trail that would take us back to base. The plan was simple: move together, use the lanterns to light up the path, and avoid drawing attention as much as possible. We started walking, each step heavier than the last. The forest seemed more closed, as if the trees had approached during the night. It was then that we realized something scary. The claw marks on the trees were now everywhere. It was as if the creature was marking its territory, or worse, guiding us to where she wanted. With each step we took, the feeling of being observed became stronger. The silence around us was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of our feet stepping on the dry leaves. The lanterns lit just enough to reveal the way ahead, but what was around remained shrouded in disturbing shadows. Connor, who was leading, stopped suddenly and pointed to the ground. There was a trail of blood, fresh, leading into a dense bush. Everyone hesitated, but Mike decided to follow the trail. "Whatever it is, we need to know what we're facing," he said, trying to sound brave. When we approached, the strong metallic smell became unbearable. In the middle of the bushes, we found the body of a deer. But it was not an ordinary scene. The animal seemed to have been torn in half with an enormous force, and there was no sign that it had been dragged or hunted naturally. Worse, marks similar to those we saw on the trees were deeply embedded in the deer's flesh. Sarah started crying again, and Connor had to turn his face. Mike bent down to examine more closely, but before he could say anything, a loud, shrill sound tore through the silence. The creature was close, very close, and seemed to warn us that we knew too much. As soon as the shrill sound echoed through the forest, we all froze. Mike stood up quickly, dropping what he was doing, and started pushing us back onto the path. "Run!" That was all he could say. Panic took over, and we started running as fast as we could, but the forest seemed to swallow us. The lanterns trembled in our hands, casting shadows that scared more than helped. The sound of the creature's heavy footsteps was now clear, and it seemed to be following us, always out of reach of the light, but close enough to make us feel its presence. Suddenly, Sarah tripped and fell. Connor and I stopped to help her while Mike and Dave kept running, not realizing it. Despair was stamped on her face as she tried to get up, but before we could continue, the sound of branches breaking came straight from behind. I looked back and saw, for just a second, a huge, distorted silhouette. It wasn't just the size that scared me, but the way it moved, fast, precise, as if it was hunting us for fun. I took Sarah by the arm, and we started running again, screaming for Mike and Dave to wait for us. But deep down, I knew that the thing was intentionally separating us, like a predator who knows his prey has no way out. We managed to reach Mike and Dave, but now we were exhausted. Each of us was constantly gasping and looking back, hoping to see that thing emerge among the trees. The silence was as oppressive as the sound of our hasty steps. It seemed the creature was playing with us, letting us run just to prolong the fear. Finally, we reached a clearing. The moon lit up the place, and for a brief moment we felt that we might have a chance. But this feeling lasted only a short time. In the middle of the clearing, we saw something that froze us to the bone. There was a circle of trees with even deeper marks of claws, as if that were the heart of the creature's territory. On the ground, scattered remains of bones shone in the moonlight, and a horrible smell, metallic and putrid, filled the air. Mike started talking, trying to come up with a plan, but was interrupted by a sound so close that it seemed to be right next to us. We looked in all directions, but we couldn't see anything. "It's here," Dave whispered, holding the lantern with his trembling hands. And that's when she appeared, no longer like a shadow or a blur, but completely visible, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us with a predatory calm. The creature was much more frightening, when seen up close. She had an upright posture, but the movements were animalistic, almost too fluid for something of that size. His eyes shone with a light that seemed to be their own, fixed on us in a way that was not just predatory. It was intelligent, as if he was calculating what we would do next. His body was covered with rough and dark fur, but the claws, long and sharp, shone in the moonlight. Nobody could move, as if the air itself had become heavy. It was as if we knew that, if we ran, it would be exactly what she wanted. Mike tried to lift the camera to record, but the creature stepped forward, and he stopped immediately. The sound of branches breaking under her weight echoed through the clearing. It was then that she let out that scream again, a guttural sound that seemed to cross our bodies. Sarah fell to her knees, covering her ears as Connor began pulling her back. "Don't make any sudden movements," Mike muttered, his voice almost inaudible. But Dave, taken by the panic, took a step back and tripped over a fallen log, releasing the lantern he was holding. It was enough for the creature to advance. She moved so fast that it seemed impossible, but instead of attacking, she stopped a few meters away from us, as if she was telling us to leave. The creature stood there, motionless, watching us. It was as if he was challenging us, waiting to see if we would make the right decision. No one dared to move, and the silence was almost more terrifying than any sound. Suddenly she gave another scream, so loud that it seemed to vibrate in the air. It was enough to break our paralysis. Mike, with his trembling voice, whispered, "Run." "Now." And we ran, each in a direction, as if the logic had disappeared and the survival instinct was the only thing that moved us. The sound of the creature's footsteps chasing us was deafening, and the clearing stood behind like a blur. I ran without looking back, just trying to put as much distance between me and that. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled several times, but fear made me stand up and continue. Heard screams from a distance, probably from Connor or Sarah, but couldn't stop. Finally, I saw something that gave me a bit of hope, an observation tower used by rangers. I climbed the wooden stairs as fast as I could, almost falling down, and locked the door behind me when I reached the top. My chest hurt, and my vision was clouded by sweat, but when I looked down into the forest, I saw nothing. The creature had disappeared again, but I knew she was still there, waiting. From up there, the silence was even more disturbing. The forest seemed frozen in time, without a single sound of insects or wind. I looked around, trying to locate the others, but all I saw were the treetops illuminated by the faint moonlight. My breathing was still fast, and my whole body was shaking, but I needed to think. Took my flashlight, now almost out of battery, and lit the floor below the tower. For a moment I saw nothing, but then I noticed movement. It wasn't the creature, it was Connor and Sarah running towards the tower. I shouted as loud as I could to get their attention, and when they looked up, I saw the relief on their faces. But before they could reach the base of the tower, hear again that guttural sound, this time coming from closer. The creature emerged from the darkness with a frightening speed, and all I could do was shout them up. Connor arrived first and started to help Sarah, who seemed to have sprained her ankle. As they went up, the creature circled the base of the tower, dropping low grunts and scratching the wooden columns. When we finally got everyone locked up upstairs, I realized we were trapped. She knew we had nowhere to go. Up there, fear was almost palpable. Sarah cried softly as she tried to massage her injured ankle, and Connor leaned against the grid, trying to keep his eyes on the creature that kept circling around the base of the tower. Mike and Dave had not yet appeared, and the silence about what might have happened to them was unbearable. The creature seemed to know that. Their grunts, mixed with that sound of scratching the wood, sounded like a provocation, as if they wanted to make us lose control. Suddenly the creature stopped. He stood there motionless, looking directly at us, his eyes shining in the dark. Do not know what was worse, to see her standing or what happened next. She began to hit the tower columns with an absurd force, making the whole structure tremble. I held Sarah and Connor to keep them from falling, but the feeling that the tower could collapse at any moment was real. "She wants to bring it down," I screamed, but my voice seemed lost in the chaos. It was then that, as if he had decided that he had tortured us enough, the creature stopped again and disappeared into the darkness of the forest, leaving no trace. The silence that followed the departure of the creature was almost as oppressive as its presence. We stayed up there, without moving, for minutes that seemed hours. No one had the courage to come down, but the uncertainty about the whereabouts of Mike and Dave weighed on our minds. Finally, Connor broke the silence. "What if she's waiting for us down there?" No one answered. The truth is that we all thought the same thing. The tower, although precarious, was our only shelter, but it was also a prison. We were out of supplies, no communication, and no idea how to get out of that forest. When the light of dawn began to rise, the forest gained a less threatening appearance, but the sense of danger persisted. We decided that we could not stay there. Carefully, we went down from the tower, always attentive to any movement. On the ground, we saw fresh marks of the creature's claws in the wooden columns, deep and frighteningly precise. We go in the opposite direction from where we saw it last time, trying to find any sign of Mike and Dave. After an hour of cautious walking, we found Mike's backpack hanging in a tree, but no sign of him or Dave. The silence of the forest seemed to observe us, as if nature itself could keep us trapped there. Finding Mike's backpack was a blow in the little mood we still had. It was hanging in a strange way, as if it had been placed there on purpose, almost as a warning. Sarah started crying again, and Connor just muttered, "That's not normal." We took the backpack and opened it, but it was empty except for a crumpled map. There were no clear traces of Mike or Dave, only claw marks on the tree trunk where the backpack was hanging. The feeling of despair grew with each step, but we knew that we could not stop. We continued walking, following the map in an attempt to find the main trail that would take us back to base. The claw marks on the trees seemed to follow us, as if the creature was marking the path we had traveled. The sun was high now, but the light did not bring safety. The forest seemed quieter than ever, and every sound we made sounded like a reminder that we were being watched. When we finally found what seemed to be the trail, we stopped for a moment to catch our breath. It was then that we saw something on the ground, partially covered by leaves, Dave's cap, stained with something dark. Nobody said anything, but the silence that followed was heavier than any word could be. Finding Dave's cap was like a punch in the stomach. We stood there, staring at that simple piece, trying to avoid the obvious questions that were going through our minds. Connor finally leaned down and picked him up, examining him closely. The dark spot looked like dry blood, and it struck us as a confirmation of what we already feared. "We need to get out of here now," he said in a trembling voice. We take the cap and go on the trail, each carrying a mixture of fear and guilt. We didn't know if they were alive, but staying there was not an option. The silence was broken again, but this time the sound was different. Something further, almost like voices. Sarah stopped immediately, eyes wide. Did you hear that?" We all stood in silence, trying to pick up the sound again. And there it was. They were voices, or at least it looked like. We could not distinguish words, but they came from inside the forest on our left. Connor wanted to ignore it and follow the trail, but something inside me told me we needed to check. If it was Mike or Dave, they would be needing help. We went in the direction of the voices, but with each step, the sound became more strange, more distorted, as if it should not be there. And then suddenly, everything was quiet again. The silence that took over the forest was so oppressive that even our breath seemed too loud. The voices we heard just disappeared, as if they had never been there. We looked at each other, and I could see the panic growing in Sarah's eyes. "That doesn't make sense," Connor muttered, but no one replied. We keep walking slower now, attentive to any sound or movement around us. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and every shadow between the trees seemed to move. After a few more minutes, we saw a small clearing. In the center, there was something that made us all stop at the same moment. A pile of bones. They were animal bones, for sure, but they were arranged in a strange way, almost like a circle. In the middle of the pile, something made us freeze. It was Mike's camera. It was partially covered in dried blood, but it looked intact. Connor bent down to pick it up, and when he turned it on, the battery still had some charge. We started watching the last recorded video, and what we saw left us speechless. The camera showed Mike running through the forest, panting, while the creature followed him. The video ended abruptly, with a scream that seemed to be his and the sound of the camera falling on the floor. We stood there, trying to process what we had just seen in the video. Mike's scream still echoed in our heads, even after the video ended. Sarah was completely terrified, and Connor couldn't stop looking at the camera as if he were expecting something else to appear. "That confirms she's smart," he said, his voice broken. She knew the camera was important. It made the panic grow even more. We were not dealing with an irrational animal, but with something that studied us, that understood how to manipulate us. We decided to leave as soon as possible, but the clearing seemed to hold us. Each path we tried seemed to lead us back to the same place, as if we were walking in circles. Connor started losing his cool, screaming into the woods, challenging whatever was following us. It was then that we heard again that guttural sound, the same one we had heard before, but this time it was much closer. The creature was no longer just watching us, it was coming. Without thinking, we started running, without direction, just trying to put the maximum distance between us and that sound. We ran without looking back, but the sound of the creature's heavy steps was closer and closer. The panic was so great that we could hardly think. The trees passed like blobs, and I felt branches cutting my skin, but nothing mattered but to run away. Sarah stumbled again, falling hard, but this time Connor and I lifted her immediately, without stopping for a second. The guttural sound now seemed to surround the forest, as if it was everywhere at once. Finally, the trail began to open up, and we saw something that looked like a small abandoned guard post. It was a simple construction made of wood, but it seemed the only chance we had. We threw it in and locked the door with a metal bar that we found there. Inside, the air was stuffy and the space tight, but at least we were protected, even temporarily. Sarah sobbed softly, and Connor tried to look out the cracks in the windows. "She's outside," he said, his voice low and tense. And then, as if to confirm, we heard. The sound of claws scratching the wood outside was unmistakable. The creature knew exactly where we were. We were cornered. The sound of the claws scratching the wood was constant, methodical, as if the creature was testing our endurance. Each scratch made the metal bar vibrate slightly, increasing the feeling that the door would not hold for long. Connor, holding a piece of wood as an improvised weapon, whispered, "No way, she's playing with us." Sarah, sitting in the corner, was shaking so much that it seemed she would faint at any moment. All I could think of was how to get out of there before the creature decided the game was over. Suddenly the sound stopped. We were in absolute silence, as if our breaths had been suspended. But the silence was even more terrifying. Something in the absence of sound made it seem as if she was planning the next move. Connor looked at me and made a gesture indicating to look through the cracks again. When we did, we saw nothing. It was as if the creature had completely disappeared. But then, from the opposite side of the hut, we heard a louder noise, as if something was being pushed. The window began to crack, and a pair of bright eyes appeared between the boards. My heart almost stopped. She was trying to get into a place we did not expect. As soon as I saw the bright eyes in the window, my body reacted before my mind could process. I took what looked like a piece of rusty metal that was on the floor and yelled for Connor to reinforce the door. Sarah, still in shock, could not move, and this only increased panic. The creature began to force the window, and the sound of wood cracking was deafening. Connor ran to me, and together we pushed an old table against the opening. It wasn't much, but it was enough to delay it for a few seconds. What happened next was so fast I can barely remember the details. The creature began to circle around the hut, hitting the walls and windows as if it were testing each weak point. The psychological pressure was unbearable. We were exhausted but could not give in. It was then that we heard another sound, something distant but recognizable. It was a helicopter. Hope lit up in us, and we started to shout, banging on the walls and trying to make as much noise as possible. The creature stopped immediately, as if he had heard too. For a few seconds, everything was quiet again, and then she disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the sound of the helicopter approaching. The sound of the helicopter became closer, until finally we saw it passing over the cabin. It was a surreal vision, almost as if salvation had come at the last moment. Connor ran outside, waving frantically with his arms as I helped Sarah get up. She was still in shock, but the sound of the propellers seemed to bring her back to reality. We all went out into the clearing in front of the hut, shouting and waving, trying to make sure they saw us. It was then that we realized something that made the fear come back with full force. The forest, once so noisy and oppressive, was now completely silent. There was no sound of footsteps or branches moving, nothing to indicate the creature's presence. It was as if she had disappeared. The helicopter hovered over us, and we saw two men coming down with equipment and weapons. They said nothing, just signaled us to come closer. As soon as we got on the plane, the pilot turned to us and with a firm voice said, "You were lucky to survive. This area has been closed for years." No one answered. As the helicopter took off, I looked for the last time into the forest below and saw, for just a second, the creature's bright eyes, watching as we moved away. We never go back there. The phantom passenger. It was a typical night of work as an app driver, and the rain fell incessantly. I was about to turn off the app and end my shift, but a last-minute rush appeared. It was in a rural area, a little far away, but the rate was good enough to convince me. I accepted the request, even with rain hindering visibility and poorly lit roads. The collection site was near an old road known to be deserted at night, but so far nothing out of the ordinary. When I arrived at the indicated point, I did not see anyone immediately. Parked the car and turned on the flashing light, looking around to see if I found my passenger. After a few minutes, I started thinking it was a hoax, but then out of nowhere, a man appeared. He was standing under a tree, with an expression that I can only describe as empty. He seemed a little confused, but signaled to me, so I unlocked the door. He got in the back seat, wet by the rain, and gave me a slight smile. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "I've been waiting a long time." Something about him seemed out of place, but I thought it was just fatigue. When I asked where he wanted to go, he told me the name of a place that I did not recognize, but it was in the app. It was a destination about 15 minutes away. I turned on the GPS and started driving. On the way, I tried to make conversation to relieve the strange weather. "This rain is strong, huh?" commented, but the man just nodded, staring out the window. His clothes looked old-fashioned, something I would associate with decades ago. A long coat and a hat that was no longer seen. The silence was uncomfortable, but I continued driving. It was then that he finally said something that left me puzzled. "It's strange to be here from new." I looked in the rearview mirror, curious, and asked, "Have you ever been down this road before?" He hesitated before answering in a low voice, "Yes, on the night of the accident." My stomach went to pieces with that sentence. I didn't know how to react, so I pretended I hadn't heard right. "What accident?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but his answer was vague. "It was a long time ago. I shouldn't be here." My heart started to accelerate, but I kept my attention on the road. He was silent again, and the sound of rain hitting the car seemed louder and louder. When we finally arrived at the place indicated, an old house abandoned in the middle of nowhere, I felt a shiver through my spine. "Here we are," he said, but when I looked in the rear view mirror to make sure he had gone down, the back seat was empty. My first reaction was to quickly turn into the back seat, hoping to find him sitting there. But there was no one. The bench was empty, dry, as if he had never been there. My heart popped, and a feeling of cold ran through my body, even with the heater on. Got out of the car looking around, thinking that maybe he had gone down without me noticing. But there was no sign of anyone. The rain was still heavy, making it all the more surreal. The house in front was gloomy, with broken windows and a facade covered with moss. It seemed that it was not inhabited for decades. When I got back to the car, trying to understand what had just happened, I noticed something in the back seat. It was an old newspaper, yellowed and partly wet. I picked it up carefully and read the headline, "Fatal Accident on Rural Road Leaves One Dead, 20 Years Ago." My body was still. The date of the newspaper was exactly 20 years earlier, on the same day. And the photo that accompanied the news made me almost leave the newspaper. It was the man I had just taken, same face, same clothes. I couldn't stay there. I turned on the car and drove as fast as I could, feeling like I was being watched all over the road. As I drove back, my mind was in complete chaos. I went through every detail, trying to find a logical explanation for what had just happened. But the more I thought, the more the pieces didn't fit. He was constantly looking in the rear view mirror, almost expecting to see that man sitting again in the back seat. The rain seemed to have subsided, but the road was still deserted, and the silence of the radio turned off made everything seem more oppressive. When I finally reached the city entrance, I stopped at a gas station. I needed a moment to get myself together. I went into the convenience store, still holding the newspaper he had left in the car, and showed it to the attendant. "Have you heard of this accident?" I asked. The man behind the counter looked at the newspaper and turned pale. "That was a long time ago, but I do remember. A car went off the road and hit a tree. The driver died instantly." He pointed to the photo. "It was the son of the owner of that big house on the road. They say he appears from time to time, especially on rainy nights." My heart almost stopped. I left the store without saying anything, returned to the car, and decided never to accept races in that region. The neighbor of the basement. I lived in a small old building in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Denver, Colorado. It was not a luxurious place, but it had its charm: exposed bricks, narrow corridors, and that typical silence of older buildings. I had moved in recently and was still getting used to the noise of the neighbors and the peculiar smell coming from the hall. Everything seemed normal until I started to notice something strange in the apartment downstairs, where a man named Edward lived. He was reserved, not very sociable, but always polite. I never thought that he could be involved in something strange. It was always in the middle of the night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, that I heard the sound of boxes being dragged. It was heavy noises, as if he was carrying furniture or something bulky. At first, I thought he was renovating the apartment, but this continued for weeks. Also, I heard muffled beats, almost as if someone was trying to get attention, but they always ended abruptly. Last week, as I was walking down the stairs to leave the building, I saw Edward carrying one of these boxes into the basement. It was one of those big old wooden boxes, and he looked nervous. When I tried to greet him, he just whispered something and hurried down the steps. After that meeting in the corridor, I began to pay more attention to Edward's movements. It was always the same pattern: heavy boxes loaded late at night, and he never stayed long in the basement. That alone was weird, but what really started to bother me were the sounds. During the early hours, when everything was quiet, I heard rhythmic beats, as if something was being hammered, and sometimes something even worse, muffled screams. At first I thought it was my imagination, or maybe some neighbor watching movies late at night, but the sounds were different. Too real. They seemed to come from within the walls. I decided I needed to investigate, could not get it out of my head, and every time I heard something coming from the basement, my instinct told me that something was wrong. One night, around midnight, I took my flashlight and went down to the basement. The place had a damp and heavy smell, like mold accumulated for decades. The concrete walls were marked by dark spots, and the lights blinked irritably. There were several doors, all locked except one, the one that Edward used. It was slightly open, with a small slit of light escaping. My heart popped. Part of me wanted to go back and pretend that nothing was happening, but another part, more curious, pushed me forward. I took a deep breath before pushing the door. The creak echoed through the basement, and for a moment, I thought Edward might be there. I waited a few seconds, but I heard nothing but the sound of water drops dripping from some old pipe. When I entered, the dim light of a lamp was swaying on the ceiling, partially illuminating the space. It was larger than I imagined, almost like a maze of narrow corridors. In the corner, I saw one of the boxes he carried. It seemed to be made of old wood, with scratches on the sides. My stomach turned to think what might be inside, but before I could approach, I heard something. It was the beats, now higher, closer. They seemed to come from a corridor on the left. My mind struggled to find a logical explanation, but my body seemed to move by itself, leading me towards the sound. The corridor was even darker, and the air seemed heavier. The beats got more intense with each step, until finally I reached a metal door with rust marks. It was from there that the sound came. I stood for a moment, with my hand hesitating on the handle, when I heard another sound. A whisper. Low, almost inaudible, but clearly human. My heart shot, and before I could think twice, I turned the knob. The door opened with a metallic creak, revealing an even darker space. I turned on my flashlight, and the beam of light illuminated something that made me freeze. The floor was covered with marks, like deep scratches on concrete, arranged in patterns that made no sense. In the corner of the room, there were more wooden boxes, but one of them was open. I approached slowly, each step accompanied by the sound of my heavy breath. When the light of the lantern illuminated the inside of the box, I saw pieces of dirty fabric and something that looked like hair stuck to an object. Immediately I backed away, my body in a state of pure panic. Before I could run, the beats began. Now they were behind me, no longer muffled, but high and intense. I turned quickly and saw a shadow moving at the end of the corridor that I had just walked through. My first thought was, Edward is here. But when the shadow passed through the oscillating light, I realized that it was much bigger than him. I was paralyzed for a moment that seemed an eternity, until the shadow began to move in my direction. The sound of the beats was now mixed with something like deep and accelerated breaths. My instinct finally took over, and I ran as fast as I could back to the staircase leading up to my apartment. I went up the stairs so fast that I could barely breathe, with the beats and that breath sound echoing behind me. When I reached my step, I almost fell when stumbling on the last step. I ran into my apartment, locking the door and putting on the safety chain. My heart seemed to explode, and my ears still picked up that sound, even though I was silent now. I leaned against the door, trying to get my head together, but my mind couldn't process what I had just seen and heard. As I tried to calm down, I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway outside. At first I thought it was another neighbor, but the steps stopped right in front of my door. I leaned down and looked through the peephole, and what I saw froze me to the bone. Edward. He was standing there, looking straight at my door, as if he knew I was watching. He did not look nervous or angry, but his empty gaze was even more disturbing. He stood there for a few seconds before saying something low, almost like a whisper. "You shouldn't have gone there." And then he just turned and went down the stairs. There I was, motionless, not knowing what to do, but one thing was certain. I couldn't spend another night in that building. After Edward came down the stairs, I was paralyzed for a long time. I had no courage to move or even think about what to do. His words, "You should not have gone there," echoed in my mind. And the worst was the certainty that he knew what I had seen. I decided that I would not spend another night in that apartment. I took the phone, and I started looking for hotels nearby. While I was packing my things in a hurry, curiosity fought against fear. Part of me wanted to understand what was happening in that basement, but the rest only wanted to get out alive. Before I left, I opened the window and looked out to the patio that led into the basement. It was dark, but something caught my eye. One of the boxes that Edward was carrying was now outside, next to the basement door. This time it was open. I could not see what was inside, but a strong smell, metallic, reached my floor. It was unbearable, and I knew that I could not stay there anymore. I took my backpack and left the apartment, trying to be as quiet as possible. But as I went down the stairs, I heard again that sound of beats, now louder and coming directly from the basement. My whole body trembled, but I did not look back. I went out the front door and did not return. The songs of the Lost Island. I will never forget the feeling I had when I set foot on that island. We called it the Lost Island because, until then, no official record mentioned it. My team, consisting of me, Dr. Emily Carter, the expedition leader, Dr. William Bill Hargrove, and technical assistants Mike and Lisa, were there to investigate enigmatic sculptures that had appeared in satellite images. It was an exciting mission, but from the moment we landed, something seemed wrong. The silence was almost absolute, except for the sound of waves crashing against the rocks and occasionally a wind that sounded almost like a whisper. On the first day, we found some of the sculptures that we had seen in the images. They were huge, made of black stone, with shapes that seemed to represent human faces, but the eyes were disproportionately large, empty, and disturbing. Bill was fascinated, while Mike and Lisa took pictures and collected samples of the surrounding soil. Everything seemed to go according to plan until the night fell. It was then that we heard the songs. They came out of nowhere, floating through the air like an ancient melody, but the words, if they were words, were impossible to understand. "Did you hear that?" I asked, and they all confirmed it with apprehensive looks. We decided to ignore, thinking that maybe it was the sounds of the wind or nature, but something in the tone of those songs seemed human. On the second night, the songs came back. This time they were louder, as if they were closer. We were gathered around the fire, reviewing our notes and discussing what we had found during the day. Mike, who was the most skeptical of the group, suddenly stood up, holding the lantern. "That's definitely not wind," he said, with an expression I had never seen in him before. Lisa, who was usually calm and practical, seemed restless, squeezing her arms against her body as if she were cold, despite the tropical climate. Bill, on the other hand, seemed fascinated. It may be some kind of ancient ritual that is still present in some way. "We need to investigate tomorrow." I could not sleep that night. The songs seemed to enter my head, even with my ears covered. It was as if the melody was vibrating in the air around me. When I finally dozed off, I had a horrible dream. I was walking the island alone, and the sculptures seemed to observe me, despite his empty eyes. The sound of the songs guided me, taking me to an opening in the earth. I woke up breathless, with the sound of the melody still echoing in my mind. By morning, I found out that I was not alone. Lisa and Mike also had nightmares, while Bill seemed more excited than ever, insisting that the chants were an essential clue. Something on that island was affecting us, but Bill seemed indifferent to the danger. The next morning, we decided to explore further on the island. Bill was determined to find the source of the songs, and even with the obvious discomfort of Mike, Lisa and I, we went forward. The dense vegetation hindered progress, but the sculptures continued to appear as if guiding us in a specific direction. The further we advanced, the more strange the sculptures became. Some seemed to represent twisted human figures, while others had animal features. I tried to ignore the feeling that we were being watched, but it was impossible. It was as if the eyes of the sculptures were following us. Around noon, we arrived at a clearing with a huge structure in the center, something that looked like an altar. The surrounding air was dense, almost oppressive, and there were marks on the ground that seemed to have been made recently. Bill was radiant, examining everything with enthusiasm, but Lisa and I stayed behind, looking at what appeared to be an underground entrance next to the altar. It was a dark opening, with worn stone steps that descended into what I can only describe as an abyss. "I think we should go back and plan better," I suggested, but Bill was determined. He was already walking down the steps with his lantern, insisting that we needed to find out what was there. Reluctantly, we followed him, with the chant starting again, now higher, as if coming directly from that tunnel. We went down the steps, each step accompanied by the songs that now echoed, almost deafening, inside the tunnel. Bill's lantern lit only a small part of the way ahead, while the rest of the space remained shrouded in dense darkness. The air was heavy, and there was a metallic smell, almost like rusty blood. The walls of the tunnel were covered with marks, symbols that seemed written, but in a language none of us recognized. Lisa tried to take pictures, but her hands were shaking so much that the camera almost fell. When we reached the end of the steps, we enter an open chamber. The floor was covered by a dark liquid that reflected the light of the lantern in a disturbing way, and in the center there was a pedestal with something that looked like a cornerstone, carved with the same pattern as the sculptures outside. But the scariest was what was on the walls. They were carved figures, larger than the natural, with bulging eyes and open mouths, as if they were shouting. The songs, which before seemed only a sound in the air, now resounded inside our heads, impossible to ignore. Mike finally broke the silence. "This is not right. We need to get out of here." But Bill was hypnotized by the stone, as if it was calling for him. When he touched it, the sound of the songs changed, becoming even more intense, almost like a collective cry. When Bill touched the stone, something in the chamber changed immediately. The air became even heavier, almost impossible to breathe, and the sound of the songs became an unbearable cacophony. I felt a pressure in my head, as if something was trying to invade my mind. Lisa fell to her knees, hands in her ears, yelling something that didn't I manage to understand. Mike tried to pull Bill back, but he seemed rooted in place, his eyes fixed on the stone and an ecstatic expression on his face. It was then that the ground began to shake, and the figures on the walls seemed to move. At first I thought it was a trick of the lantern light, but the sculptures were really changing. The sculpted eyes seemed to gain depth, shining with a cold and intense light. The mouths, before static, began to open more, emitting a guttural sound that mixed with the songs. Something was waking up, and I knew it wasn't human at all. "Bill, let go of that now." I cried out, but he seemed unable to hear me. That's when the stone began to pulse, emitting a faint light that filled the chamber. Mike, in a last effort, managed to pull it out, and the connection was broken. But the harm had already been done. The ground cracked beneath us, and a deep sound, almost like a laugh, echoed through the tunnel. We knew we needed to get out of there, but the feeling that something was following us was overwhelming. We ran as if our lives depended on it, and at that moment they probably did. The tunnel behind us began to crumble, and the cracks in the ground spread like cobwebs. The songs continued, but now they seemed to be coming from inside our heads, as if they were part of our own thoughts. Lisa tripped and fell, screaming for help. Mike and I stopped to pull her back while Bill, still with an oddly apathetic expression, walked like a sleepwalker, ignoring everything around. "Bill, run!" I cried, but he seemed completely disconnected from reality. When we finally reached the steps, the feeling of relief lasted only a second. Something was moving in the darkness behind us. We can't see clearly, but the glowing eyes of the carved figures now seemed alive, as if they were watching us with an insatiable hunger. We went up the stairs with the maximum speed we could, almost carrying Lisa, who could barely walk. When we finally emerged on the surface, the sound of the chants stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more disturbing. Bill fell to his knees, mumbling unconnected words about the stone and they. I looked back at the entrance of the tunnel and saw something that I will never forget. A pair of eyes shining in the darkness fixed on us. Something down there was still alive, and now I knew we were there. We were out of the tunnel, but the feeling of danger had not passed. The silence around us was oppressive, as if the island itself were holding its breath. Lisa was breaking down emotionally, crying and repeating that she should never have come. Mike tried to calm her down, but it was clear that he was also terrified. Bill, on the other hand, was lying on the ground, mumbling incomprehensible things. "They are waiting. They were always waiting," he said, as if in a trance. I looked at him, and it was then that I realized something terrible. Bill's eyes, before normal, now had a faint glow similar to what we saw in the camera. Mike tried to pull him up, but Bill resisted. "I need to go back. They showed me the truth." Those words froze me to the bone. He was not the same. Something had happened when he touched the stone, something that was now inside him. As Mike argued with Bill, trying to bring him back to reality, a low sound and depth began to echo through the island. It was no longer the songs. It was something different, more visceral, like a giant drum beating under the earth. "We have to get out of here now," I cried, pulling Lisa by the hand. Bill stood, looking at the entrance of the tunnel as if he was waiting for something. It was when the ground began to shake again, and we heard a sound coming from the trees. Heavy steps, as if something huge was moving towards us. The heavy footsteps echoed through the trees, and it was impossible to tell where they came from. They seemed to surround the clearing, getting closer. Bill stood motionless, staring at the tunnel entrance while the rest of us struggled with panic. Lisa started begging, "Bill, please come with us." But he didn't react. Finally, Mike lost his temper and pulled him hard. "If you want to die here, die alone, but I won't." The shock seemed to bring him back, but the look in Bill's eyes was still empty, distant. We started running back to the beach where our boat was anchored. The dense vegetation made every step seem a challenge, and the sound of the steps behind us did not diminish. Worse, it seemed like there was more than one thing following us now. The trees around us swung, and for a moment I saw something in the shadows, a tall, deformed silhouette with arms too long to be human. Did not want to stop to look again. When we finally reached the shore, the boat was still there, but the tide had risen, and he was stuck on a rock rise. "Let's push it into the water," Mike shouted, and we started working frantically, with the sounds of the creatures getting closer and closer. Pushing the boat seemed an impossible task. The tide was rising quickly, and the stones hindered any progress. Lisa was panicking, looking out into the forest behind us where the heavy footsteps kept coming closer. "They're coming," she cried out, the voice trembling with pure terror. Mike and I kept pushing with all our might, while Bill stood still, looking out at the horizon, muttering those disconnected words about them. I knew he was lost, but we didn't have time to save him. Finally, the boat started to move, and the feeling of relief was overwhelming. We managed to push it into the water, but when I looked back, I saw the figures emerging from the forest. They were huge, with distorted shapes that defy any logic. The eyes shone, just like those we saw in the camera. They did not run. They just walked towards us, as if they knew there was nowhere to run. "Bill, come now," I cried, but he did not move. He just looked at me with that empty look and said, "I belong to them now. And before we could do anything, he walked towards the creatures, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. There was no time to process what had just happened. As soon as Bill disappeared among the trees, the creatures shifted their focus to us. They began to move faster, and the sound of their heavy steps made the ground tremble. Mike and I pulled Lisa into the boat as the water began to shake violently, as if the tide itself was against us. Finally, we were able to start the engine, and the boat began to move away from the island. The feeling of relief lasted only a few seconds, because when looking back, we saw the creatures standing on the beach, watching us. Their silhouettes were huge, and the shining eyes seemed to penetrate our soul. Lisa cried uncontrollably, while Mike kept the boat's engine running at full speed, trying to get away as fast as possible. I could not take my eyes off the island, which seemed increasingly shrouded in shadows, despite the approaching dawn. Then, as if to seal our departure, the songs began again. This time they were different, higher, more intense, and inside our heads. I plugged my ears, but it did not help. Lisa started screaming, and Mike, with his pale face, almost lost control of the boat. But as soon as we crossed a certain distance, the chanting stopped abruptly, as if it had never existed. When the singing ceased, the silence was so absolute that it seemed even more terrifying. Lisa was in shock, sitting on the bottom of the boat, arms around her knees, swaying slightly. Mike didn't say anything. He just kept his eyes on the horizon, as if he didn't want to look back for a second. I couldn't speak either. Whatever that thing was, those creatures, the island, didn't seem natural. There was no scientific explanation for what we saw, and that was the most disturbing. It was as if we had entered into something that was not to be found. When we finally reached the larger boat that would take us back to civilization, we were all exhausted, physically and emotionally. Lisa refused to talk about what happened, and Mike just murmured something about forgetting everything. But even as we drifted away safely, I knew that I could never erase that experience from my mind. Bill's look before disappearing into the forest, the songs that seemed to penetrate our consciousness, and the bright eyes of the creatures, all this stayed with me. Even today, when I think of the lost island, I feel like something is watching us, waiting. I know I will never set foot there again, but sometimes on quiet nights I can almost hear the songs again, echoing from afar, like a call that will never completely disappear.